Okay, welcome to the Wichita-Sedgwick County Historical Museum. I'm Eric Kale, the museum's director, and we thank you for being here today. We're pleased to bring you this program, and it's possible through a grant through the Charles and Joanne McIlwaine Foundation. We also thank the City of Wichita and Sedgwick County Board of Commissioners for their annual operational support, and all of you who support the museum as members. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our McIlwaine speaker for this quarter, and we appreciate him coming to town. And he is an aviation historian and author, Ed Phillips. Welcome, Ed Phillips.
Thank you. I want to thank Eric and Zach and everybody else for the opportunity to come here. I was here 10 years ago. Is anybody here then? Same auditorium? 10 years ago. Yeah, okay. Well, we're doing okay. Is the volume good in the back? All right. Well, we're going to talk about three things this afternoon, one being E.M. Laird, and then also Lloyd Stearman, and also the Women's Air Derby. And because I picked these out to think, well, I've never done those before, and I don't know what everybody knows. So we'll just kind of go with a selection here, and then tomorrow will be a little bit different and end with the B-29. So first off, Laird planes, a legacy of speed, and E.M. Laird figured prominently in the beginning of this city's aviation legacy. And it began for him in 1912 when he built his first airplane in the attic of his parents' house in Chicago, because he's a Chicago boy. And he'd always had an interest in aviation from an early age. And he worked at a bank, so he made a little bit of money, and he used that money to build this particular airplane you see here, which did not have an engine in it. He had to go find an engine, and he ended up using a motorcycle engine that was cut in half by somebody who had a good machine shop, and ended up with something to power his airplane. And this is another view of the same airplane with Maddie standing there. So they lowered it down from the attic window and put it together on the street. Whatever it takes. But it was wing warping, and you can see the size of the tail skid. That's the biggest tail skid I've ever seen. But anyway, and he did teach himself to fly in this airplane later on. There's no pictures I could ever find of this airplane in flight. Would be extremely rare. Or even on the ground, for that matter, after he had flown it. It eventually was wrecked by a friend, but that happens when you loan your airplanes out. So the next airplane that he built was called the baby biplane, and this was a very successful design. And in 1915, as it mentions there, he used it for exhibitions. Now, he learned very quickly that there was money to be made. Just go fly an airplane at a park or at some type of a civic get-together or a fair. They pay good money, for that matter. And I'm going to inject little things as I go along. But Clyde Cessna used to be what kind of a dealer? Car dealer. Car dealer. He gave that up because of the money he could make flying exhibitions. And the most he made was like $500 for 5 minutes in the air. That's how much they would pay. And he said, I'm going to forget the car business. I'm going to go do this airplane thing. He paid a lot for that. But in any case, this engine here is a 4-cylinder Hofer that had 12 horsepower. That's about the same as the Wright brothers airplane. But he did go with ailerons for the roll control and a very small fuel tank, because he didn't need a whole lot of fuel. He just flew exhibitions for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then that was it. They'd fuel it up and go to the next one. Okay. And here again, the 1916 season, he modified it a little bit with a fairing in front of the cockpit, and it's really hard for you to see it, but I'll try to point it out. It's right there. So he's always trying to improve the engine. And it was air-cooled, that's why it's sticking up so high out of the cowling there. And it was very successful, but he did no aerobatics in this airplane. And by this time, the United States was getting close to entering World War I, and when that happened, all civil flying ceased. So he was doing okay. And his friend, Buck Weaver, if you ever heard of Buck Weaver, he was a friend of his, and they had this aerial exhibition company that they worked together. Now, one of the things, how many of you are in pilots in here? We got some pilot. Okay. If you notice, I like to point these things out. The enormous travel of the elevator, huge amount of travel in order to fly the airplane. And you got to remember, Matty had no engineering background. He just figured it out as he went. He's very smart in that area. Made his own propellers as well. But the airplane did fly very good. Now, here's another view of the baby biplane. I like this shot because it kind of shows it from the top. And he and Buck Weaver teamed up, and they flew at county fairs and other exhibition events. Worked pretty good. It was making so much money in exhibition flying that he quit the bank job. Sounds like Clyde Cessna. But in any case, it began his rise as a very competent designer and engineer who built over 30 years. He did about 150 airplanes later on, as we'll see. But his name was synonymous with custom-built airplanes, not large numbers. Okay, the next airplane, this airplane is called the Bone Shaker, and it was well named because the engine went away from an inline four-cylinder to a six-cylinder Anzani static air-cooled radial. And they were 45 horsepower. Now, there were so many of these left over, from the war and even before the war. Clyde Cessna bought, if I remember correctly, he had a surplus of 100 Anzanis stuffed away in his storage area when he was building airplanes here because they were so affordable. They weren't the best radial engine in the world, but they did the job. It was okay. And they had a very large propeller, and the engine turned about 1,300 RPM. And this is when he began to do loop-to-loop. So he began advertising himself as Laddie Laird the Looper at all the county fairs. And he did very well with it. Now, this airplane still exists. It's in the Ford Museum in Dearborn. Anybody seen it? It's hanging up in there. And, of course, it shook. It just shook like crazy, which is why everybody called it the Bone Shaker. But it was a good airplane and the best flying one he had come up with yet. And this is another airplane that he built before he came to Wichita, was the Model S, S for Sport. He built two of these before he left Chicago. And these are really, to me, is a very pretty airplane. There's only a few views of it available. This one's from the top. But you can see 4 ailerons now and a little bit larger empennage and elevators. And it was a 2-seat airplane. And it was a very successful design for him. Now we turn to Wichita. How does Matty Laird figure into Wichita? Very, very significantly. Jacob Melvin Moellendick, and I suspect everybody in here knows that name, he was a wildcatter and had a lot of oil wells and a lot of money. And in 1919, he convinced Matty Laird to come to Wichita to build airplanes. And the reason that was the case is because Buck Weaver told Moellendick about Laddie because he'd spent a lot of time with him. So he knew he was a good designer, a good self-taught engineer, and he had a new design, but no money to build it. So he told Moellendick, get him down here, and let's see what we can do about this. So Moellendick, I want to stop and say, Moellendick, he was a bellicose, difficult guy to get along with. Everybody I've checked out said the same thing, including Laird. But he was a visionary. He understood the value of aviation and the fact that he wanted to make Wichita the primary hub of commercial aviation. That's how far ahead he was thinking. So he did manage to get Matty Laird down here, and this is a picture in one of the buildings, probably the Watkins Manufacturing Building is no longer there. This is the first Laird tractor biplane that he wanted to build in Chicago, but had to come here to do it. Now, I want to make sure, tractor does not mean he's going to use it in the field, okay? Tractor simply meant that it was an engine in the front and it pulled the airplane along, as opposed to a pusher. So we're going to find that name didn't stay very long. But interesting construction, just very standard, nothing revolutionary about it, or even evolutionary about it, except one thing. It had a 2-person front cockpit. That was good, because all the World War I surplus airplanes, like the Jennies and all that, they had just room for one in the front. And we're going to mention in a little bit why that's important. And here is the wicker pilot seat. Yeah. Everything had to be kept light because he only had 90 horsepower to work with. And this is a terrible photograph, but I don't apologize for it because it's very rare. This is the first airplane that you just saw being built. And you'll notice that it is, the radiator here is circular with holes cut in it. And eventually that was replaced by a different radiator, as you'll see. But it was a double bay, a biplane. It had a bay here and a bay here. And just conventional, standard gear and a tail skid, no brakes, no nothing. And when it first flew, one of the people here in Wichita said it flies like a swallow. So they got rid of the tractor, called it the Swallow, with a very good advertising change there. Okay, that's a little bit too fast. Here we go. So the Laird Swallow, when they built them here in downtown at the Watkins place, and then they assembled them in the Forum building, and then they took them all the way up to 29th and Hillside and test flew them up there. So it wasn't the greatest way to do it, but it worked. And Matty and Moellendick got along pretty well. Matty was very gentle, quiet man, was very slow to do the next thing, where Jake was ready to jump ahead. Just jump ahead, let's do this. But these are two airplanes that the Norse Motor Oil Company built, or bought rather, and flew those. And there's a number of letters in Laird's file that I was able to see about how they praised this airplane for that extra person in the front cockpit. That was his biggest selling asset that they had. Now this one is a little bit of a troublemaker. What happened was Jake Moellendick wanted Matty to build a 7-place feeder airliner to fly between Wichita and Kansas City. We're talking 1920. That might be a little premature, but nevertheless, Matty built it, and here it is. And this was called the Laird Limousine. A limousine. You notice the triple tail and 2 OX5 engines, and that's Buck Weaver in the cockpit up here, right there. It was woefully, and that's not a strong word, woefully underpowered. There was no way you could take enough fuel and carry 7 passengers and a pilot and get even 1/4 of the way to Kansas City. But it was a start. Got to give him credit for that. So Matty, this is a good picture of him when he was here in Wichita. I should mention, I almost forgot. What happened to this airplane? Well, it had 3 different engines installed in it. It went from a twin engine to a single engine, and then to a 0 engine because Moellendick said, burn it. And they did. They stripped everything off of it and burned it over there near a field at Fairmount College, where it landed for the last time. Walter Beech had a lot to do with this airplane. He couldn't make it run right. He had a Packard engine in it and a Liberty engine in it, 2 OX5s. None of them were enough power for this airplane. So I just want to mention that. So Matty, he was a very, very important spark here in Wichita to get the aviation business moving along with Moellendick. But in October of 1923, he had had all he could take of Moellendick. It seems to be very clear. The tension between them had become unbearable. And Matty, not interested in getting into dogfights, said, I'll just leave. So the agreement that I understood from Mr. Laird is he got 3 airplanes and $1,500 and a promise to Moellendick that he would not use the word swallow in any of his products that he was going to build in Chicago. And on the other hand, he got Moellendick to swear that he was not going to use Laird's name in any way, shape, or form. So they just quietly split and went back to Chicago. So the first airplane that he built in Chicago was a Laird commercial, and it's an interesting design, but it's down to a single bay biplane. Here, a little bit smaller. Everybody had to find a place to put the rotor radiator. It doesn't look very good up top, but that's where he put it. I guess that's where it worked best. So at this point, Laird disappears from the Wichita scene. So, and we're set up to transition, right? We're going to transition to the next story because Laird just simply meant that he was so important to get this business underway because he had an airplane and he was avid. So we're going to transition now to Stearman. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, Eric and I worked it out, so if you have questions or comments, we're going to hold them until we dismiss. And then I'll stay here, and I'll be glad to answer anything that I can, as long as it's truthful. Okay, so Stearman airplanes. Now, a legend in their own time. I like a lot to do with Lloyd Stearman. He was a great man. And he was also not a graduate engineer, but he was a pilot, and he was a good engineer, self-taught, so to speak, like Matty Laird. He was an aviator, and he was an entrepreneur. And he was another one of these people that was significant in helping to get aviation started in Wichita. Kind of took over from where Laird left off. You know, if Matty Laird had never come here, I'm not even sure we'd have anything to talk about today. And Jake Moellendick, tough as he was, he had the money to get it started, and he had a vision. So don't ever forget about that man. He was a good man, and he had a lot to do with this. So Lloyd Stearman, here's a little bit of background. When he was born, I know you can read that. I'll just point a few things out. 1898, he married a wife. I've never heard this name anywhere else. Virgil Ethel. And I checked that, multiple sources and multiple books, and they all say, yes, that's correct. So anyway, and they had William Lloyd and Marilyn Ruth. Now, Marilyn Ruth and I communicated a lot when I was researching the Stearman book, and she told me a lot of very interesting things about her dad. And then William Lloyd served, when I talked to him, he said he served under 9 U.S. presidents, including Henry Kissinger, who was his aide. So he had a lot to do with the White House. He was also in Vietnam and in World War II. So I'll tell you a little bit more about him later. But he was a very interesting man. He's passed away now. So Stearman was going to college, and then when we went into World War I in 1917 in April, he served in the U.S. Navy Reserve. Now, one of the things that we run into here, a lot of books that you will read show that Stearman learned to fly in an N9 float plane in the Navy. Not true. And I can say that because I checked it out with the Navy. Okay? And he didn't. He flew N9 float planes out in California, but he never got his wings because the armistice came along and they just quit everything. You know, and they weren't going to continue to do that. Where he's going to learn to fly, if you remember, is in a Laird Swallow. When he went to work for Matty Laird in 1920 is when he learned how to fly. Okay? And you didn't require a license by then. You just learned how to fly. Okay, so he found his Stearman aircraft in December 1926. We'll talk about that. He died in 75. He held an air transport number 1904, mechanic certificate 1162, and over 2,000 hours in the air. So he was a very competent pilot and very well qualified to do what he did. He was also a very good violinist. Any of you knew that or not? Violinist and some other things, yeah. That he was not just in aviation. So he's a very well-known person, a very important person. There's a picture of his family. Some of you probably never seen this, but Marilyn sent this to me. And that's Marilyn on the left with the little baby doll, and William and Virgil Ethel, and Lloyd smoking a cigarette, which he did a lot. And then old Ching here, that was the name of their dog. And one other thing. One thing that Lloyd Stearman had a fondness for back here, if I can get it, is a Packard. He loved Packard automobiles. So he always had Packards. So this is in 1930 at the Trusty Farm in Missouri. Okay. Now, Matty Laird. Matty Laird figures in here, too, because he's one of the ones that... Whoop. Okay, clear it. That's okay, Carl. He hired Stearman, who was working here in an architectural firm, and when he saw that Laird was building airplanes downtown, he went and applied and got the job. And this is a view of a Swallow, but this one was powered by the optional Hispano-Suiza Wright-built engine of 150 or 180 horsepower, which gave the airplane a whole lot more pep. That's for sure. But they also cost a lot of money. As a matter of fact, going ahead to Travel Air, if you forgive me for doing it, but I want to say this, Travel Air would not stock Hispano-Suiza engines because they were so expensive. If the customer wanted one, they built the airframe, and then they supplied the engine. And Travel Air would install it. So this was not a cheap power plant by any means. And here's another view of a Swallow, this time with the OX, the standard OX5 Curtiss in the front. But if you just look at this, I like this photo because of the double bay, and you look at all the flying wires and brace wires and landing wires, and it's no wonder these were popular for wing walking. You always got something to hold on to. Felt very secure. Now, here we are in the Watkins, downtown. You've probably seen this photograph at some point. But Lloyd Stearman is right here, building the Swallow fuselages. And they had simple jigs and fixtures to build that. It was a wood airplane, basically. And you can see the production line here. You just started with the fuselage, and then you added some cables, and then somebody put the fabric on and the metal, and the engine was installed. Now, if you remember that Model S Sport that he built in Chicago, there it is. One of them came down here. I don't know what happened to it. It was one of the prettiest airplanes he ever designed, in my opinion. But nevertheless, so they're building the Swallow here, and you notice it's got a little area to put some packages or a small suitcase. But Lloyd Stearman is busy with working on those airplanes. Okay, so after Laird left in October 23, then Moellendick made a couple of changes. Lloyd Stearman became chief engineer. He had learned a lot from Matty, and I know that. He learned a lot from Matty. But he became chief engineer. Walter Beech became general manager of the factory, as well as chief demo pilot. And this airplane that was designed is called the New Swallow, and you can see that it's very different. Smaller, more compact, single bay, OX5 engine, but the engine is fully cowled. And that was not the first time that happened, but in an American airplane that was of this class, that was different. So Lloyd Stearman, in one of the times that he talked with the press, he said, "This airplane is totally my design. Nobody else had anything to do with it." He emphasized that. So I guess that's the case in this particular indication. So up to this point, they'd built about 43 of the old Swallows, and now they began to build the New Swallow. And this is a picture of young Lloyd standing next to that airplane. I like those flying goggles. No, but it was a very clean design. He was very good at clean design. He had an eye for that. And when we get to his California airplanes, you really see his talent coming out. And this is just a general shot of a New Swallow delivering a propeller. Checker Air Service. And you can see the front cockpit here. You can see how it's cut out real deep so two people can get in and out without too much trouble. The pilot, he's got to shoehorn himself into the back cockpit. A successful airplane. So again, this is the management team at Swallow as of 1924. Walter Beech on the left, Jake in the middle, Lloyd Stearman on the right. And there would later be conflict between those two and Jake, and we'll mention that. But nevertheless, they did well. And Walter was a very good demo pilot, and everybody probably knows that. But he was also a good general manager. So in December of 1924, late 1924, there was a lot of pressure from Beech and Stearman on Jake to get rid of the wood fuselage, to get rid of that and go over to a welded steel tubing, because that was the trend now by this time. And Jake said, no, we'll build it in wood. So what they ended up doing, and you probably know the story, they contacted Clyde Cessna. They got a hold of Walter Innes Jr., who ran a business here, and a couple of investors, and Walter and Lloyd, and they started the Travel Air Manufacturing Company. Now, at this point, I'm not going to talk about Travel Air for a reason. That next year, is the 100th anniversary of Travel Air. And all I'm going to say is there is a number of organizations in this town that are planning a celebration about that, and I think that's very appropriate because Travel Air was the big company here. Even after Cessna got started and Stearman got started, Travel Air was really a strong company worldwide, not just in the U.S. They were a major manufacturer. So I'm going to hold off saying anything about Travel Air, but unless they ask me to come back next year, I'll be glad to. But nevertheless, that's all I want to say. I don't want to steal any thunder from anybody. But here is Lloyd with the first Travel Air, called a Model A, Okay, there was never a Model 1000. You'll see that in a lot of books and all. There was never a Model 1000. It was a Model A. And Stearman's input to the company was the blueprints for this Model A. Now, it looks a lot like the new Swallow, yes, but it was a very pretty airplane. You can, again, see some of the lines that he had. And this is Lloyd right here. And he's being congratulated by a member of the Aeronautic Association for the fact that the airplane carried all this weight in the front, and that's Earl Beech, B-E-A-C-H, no relation to Walter, okay? He's the pilot, and he flew these. And this was all done at the California section, down there where the old Cessna factory used to be. The California section is where they used to do a lot of flight testing. So that's all we're going to see on that. Okay, and this is Walter Beech flying the first Travel Air over Kansas countryside. And I checked it out. It's definitely him. That's for sure. And later on, Lloyd Stearman engineered the installation, along with a couple of other engineers there, Herb Rawdon and some others, of the first J4 Wright radial, static air-cooled radial engine on a Travel Air airframe. And that's what you see here. This is called a Model B, W for Wright. And this airplane was bought by a gentleman here in town, and it cost him $8,600. And $5,600 of that was for the engine. The rest of the airplane was cheap compared to that. I don't know whatever happened to this airplane, but it was a pretty bird, that's for sure. Very nice. And then we have this photo, and that is Walter Beech and Mac Short. How many people have heard of Mac Short? Anybody in here ever heard of Mac Short? That's too bad, because he was a prominent Wichitan and a major graduate aeronautical engineering, MIT. So he was not to be trivialized, you know, and he was very talented. And he and Lloyd teamed up in the summer of 1925 and built this speedster, Travel Air. And it was a one-off airplane with a 160 horsepower Curtiss engine, and Walter flew it and won quite a few air races in the area, in the Midwest. So he's just congratulating them on that. Eventually the airplane went to California and it disappeared. That happened a lot. Now, in 1926, in October, Stearman announced that he was leaving Travel Air and he was going to go to California and build airplanes. Now, this is a horrible photograph, but if it has historical significance, I'm going to use it. And this is the very first Stearman Aircraft, Inc. factory, okay, in Santa Monica, California. So it's hard to see, but they started building the first two airplanes in here, then put them on a truck, took them to Clover Field, which I'll show you, and assembled them and test flew them. So this is really where Stearman got started in his aircraft manufacturing. So here's a picture of Clover Field in 1926. And you can see out here, notice these are streets that are being lined up, and guess what's going to happen to the airport? You know, bad urban planning, and the airport gets squeezed. So I want to show you the next slide. Look at this area right here, and now look at it. Boom, there's the streets. They're ready to build right up to the airport. We'll still have that problem, don't we? But the main point here is this is Stearman's hangar right in here, and it was where the airplanes were assembled and then test flown. And Clover Field was very popular at that time, military and commercial, and even Donald Douglas had his facility here when he started out. Now here's the first airplane, the Stearman C-1. Now, if you like airplanes, you got to say that's a pretty airplane. It's very, very aesthetic just to look at it. The smooth lines that he came up with for that, and it's not a Travel Air. You don't see hardly any Travel Air in it at all. It's a Stearman. And you notice that he reversed the exhaust stacks so they would exhaust out this way instead of this way. He also came up with the first rubber hydraulic. We combined a rubber disc and hydraulic suspension for the gear, which was better than bungee cords. That's for sure. And it was a two-place in the front and a single cockpit in the back. And this also gives you a good view of the hangar. And Lyle Hoyt, which I'll show you in a minute, was the one who was able to bring Stearman out to California and tell him, look, there's money out here, a lot of money. There's a lot of Hollywood people, and they fly, and they'll buy airplanes. Just come out and do it. So that's what he did. Unfortunately, they only built 4 before he had to leave. But nevertheless, this is the first one. And here are the 3 people. Here we have Fred Hoyt, who was a good friend of Stearman, Lloyd himself, often in a business suit, by the way, and George Lyle. And Lyle and Hoyt owned this area here. Lyle Hoyt, blah, 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 blah. They sold Swallows and Traveler airplanes. Really knew Walter Beech very well. So that's just another view of that particular airplane. The other thing is, you notice the water radiator is not above the wing, it's not below. In the landing gear, it's faired in right here. Beautifully done. The craftsmanship was just amazing. There's another view. You can see it a little bit better. Then what happened was Varney Airlines got some contracts for airmail and wanted Stearman to build him an airplane for that. So he took the standard C1 and C2 airframe that we just looked at and put a Wright J4 on it. He had plenty of experience doing that. And turned this into the CMB. So it was a mail-carrying airplane. And there's a couple of things to point out. First, the radial engine. And then first, this front cockpit would hold about 400 pounds of mail. This wasn't going to carry anybody. But one thing is easy to overlook. You see the windshield right here is heavily reinforced with metal at the front because people are going to throw bags in there, throw the bags in there, bound to hit that windshield and damage it. So they beefed that up really, really good. I thought that was an interesting engineering point. So then in 1927, Stearman was not forced to leave California. You will read books and you'll see articles, and I understand where they thought this, that he was going bankrupt and didn't have any way to stay there. That's not true. Even his family knew about that. He had plenty of orders for new airplanes, but he had no money to build them. They didn't want to wait. They didn't want to wait for the money. They didn't want to give him enough of a deposit. So finally, Walter Innes, everybody heard of him? Yes, Innes Jr., and got some other men together and raised $60,000 and got Lloyd to come back here and build airplanes. So that's the short story. And where did he go? He went to the old Burton Car Works here, way up where Coleman is, up in that area now. And this has been heavily retouched, but nevertheless it does show Stearman on there. If you walk into that plant, and you can still go into that, I don't think they've taken that building down. I was there about 10 years ago. And so much of what you'll see in some photos, you can still find out, that airplane was sitting right here. Oh, that one was over there. It's that good. There's enough left to do that. So here's one of the first airplanes that they built here in Wichita. Very similar to the first one, except it's got a front cockpit and not a mail plane. And then later on, in 1929, Varney wanted a big beast of a mail plane, and they designed, Max Short and Lloyd did the M2. And it was a big airplane. You can see how much bigger it is. And this whole area up here was multiple hoppers for up to 1,000 pounds of mail. And the more you could carry, the more money you could make. That's the way it was back then. And it had a 525 horsepower Wright Cyclone engine on it, very powerful engine. And the men that are standing here is Lloyd and Max Short, and this gentleman starts figuring in very prominently, Julius Earl Schaefer. So the Schaefer family here in town, okay? And Lloyd hired him to manage the company, and he did a very good job. And when we get to the B-29, you'll hear a lot about Earl Schaefer and what he did to make things work. Okay, and then Stearman also had some different airplanes like the Business Speedster, and this happens to show Catherine Stinson sitting in the cockpit. The Stinson sisters, they're very famous. So he was still building custom airplanes, but he was also getting lots of orders, and production was great. I mean, they were really busy in 1928, 1929, couldn't keep up with the orders. They also built the LT-1, which was like an M2, but it had room for 4 passengers in the front, if you were brave enough to fly in it, okay? Because this was a noisy airplane. You're right behind that 525 horsepower engine, and you had no heat, no air conditioning, so you see that they have put in sliding windows, and everybody's looking out the window, you know? You kind of got like a dog. You stick your head out, you know, and yeah, anyway. And then in 1930, after United Aircraft and Transport Corporation absorbed Stearman into their fold. Now, you know also in 1929, Travel Air was absorbed by who? Curtiss-Wright. Yeah, so this was happening because they were so successful. And Stearman was able to move into this brand new building in 1930. And we'll see more about this in a little bit. But obviously, this is South Oliver, right in here. And you can see the original factory that they were going to be able to produce enough airplanes to meet demand. And then what happened on Wall Street? The crash. Yeah, and that really took them out, almost. Stearman is the only company. Travel Air failed, closed its doors. Cessna failed, closed its doors. Swallow went bankrupt, closed its doors. Stearman stayed open by the skinniest margins, thanks to Boeing and Julius Earl Schaefer. The man doesn't get enough credit. Now here's the Model 4 that they replaced the M2 and the LT1 with this airplane, basically not as big, but it could do the job. All right. You might notice a hangar in the background. That dates this one, out on the airport. And then they built a number of beautiful Model 4Es for Standard Oil and some other oil companies, and they were just for executive transport. Very nice. And there's only 1 or 2 of these left. Very rare. And then he also had a dedicated mail plane as well. And you can see here the hoppers in the front. And American Airways bought 12 of those. And from what I understood, from sources that I could rely on, they were about to close the doors on Stearman, and when the salespeople were able to get this order for 12 airplanes, and that saved them just enough to get them through for a few months until Boeing began to give them subcontract work on the B-17 and also their airliner as well. So they came pretty close, but they were able to survive thanks to Boeing. I like that one, yeah. Anyway, so this, again, this is the Cloud Boy. This is one of Stearman's last designs before he left the company. And it was designed to be an entry-level trainer because they had all the other airplanes that you could step up to, but they needed a trainer. And he and Max Short designed this airplane, and there were only 6 of them made, and there's 1 or 2 left that you can see. And they tried to get military contracts that didn't work. And I should mention that at this point, with the Depression going on, commercial airplanes just were not being built, and they weren't being sold. As a matter of fact, Clyde Cessna, he had his DC-6 airplane, beautiful cabin airplane, monoplane, that normally sold for about $12,000. And in 1930, you could see them listed in certain aviation newspapers, brand new, zero time, $5,000, couldn't sell it. This is terrible. So what did they do? They turned to military contracts. And the only reason Stearman could do that was because of Boeing's influence. All right, and this is a Model 80 Stearman, and I think it's safe to say most historians, basically, this is the height of Stearman biplane design, but he didn't design it. This is a Max Short airplane and his staff. And it was built for Mr. Vett, who came up with the Huck rivet. Anybody heard of Huck rivets? Well, he's the one. And he had this airplane specifically designed just for him. And you notice it had the cockpit canopy, which was pretty innovative for that time, and a powerful engine, and only 2 of these were built, an 80 and an 81. But here's where the story changes. So the Air Corps and the Navy were desperate to get some type of new trainers. They were using World War I type trainers. They were good trainers. They were consolidated trainers. Nothing wrong with them. But the Max Short and some other gentlemen there in the factory took Lloyd's design from the Model 6 Cloudboy and tweaked it into the Model 70, which is what you see here, the Stearman everybody thinks about, for the most part. And this is the first one that flew. But it was a very hard sell to get military contracts out of Congress. But eventually, the Navy did order some airplanes and Model 70s, and they put surplus J5 engines from the late 20s. Didn't need new engines, they just used surplus engines, but it kept Stearman in business. So they built some of those for the Navy, and eventually the Air Corps was able to get money, and they got an improved version, the 75, which becomes probably the icon that we're used to seeing with the PT-17, the PT-13, and that's the airplane here being tested. And then there's another version of it there, either the Lycoming or the Continental, and later on a Jacobs. And the Navy had a lot of these airplanes. And there was one, Model 76, which is the export version, sold to South America. And you'll notice it's got a 30 caliber machine gun up here and one here as well. So, and it could carry racks for light bombs as well. So, and they sold quite a few down south on that. And then here's an airplane with a canopy that they sold to Canada for flight training in the war, but it just did not work out. Matter of fact, Canada returned almost all the 300 Stearmans back here because can you imagine flying in Canada in the winter without a canopy in an open cockpit and you're trying to teach somebody how to fly? No, they're not going to work. That's for sure. But this is when they had the money now. This is 1939, 1940. There was all kinds of Stearmans at Randolph Field in Texas where they were beginning to train the pilots because they could see what was happening in Europe was already at war, and the Japanese were getting very aggressive. That's for sure. So they had to make a move. And this is just a shot of a PT-13A with the instructor in the front, and he's talking to this guy. You know, be careful. And you can see the student, he's just got a grin on his face. He has no idea what's going on. But anyway, yeah, it worked pretty well. And here's a shot of an airplane in flight with the instructor. He's got his seat jacked up so he can get nice, cool air, and he can also see better. And the student, he's looking down at the ground. I have no idea why. But I want to mention, everybody in here heard of Tuskegee Airmen? Okay, this is one of their airplanes. Okay, that is a black student pilot in that airplane. And that's great. It was wonderful because they had every bit of an ability to fly an airplane as well as any white man. That's my opinion. You can print that if you want. But anyway, I'm glad that they did that. Eleanor Roosevelt had a lot to do with that. But nevertheless, this is one of their Stearmans they used in Alabama. And now Stearman also designed a couple of airplanes that didn't make it, the X-100 here and the 120. They were good airplanes, but they didn't end up with any contracts. And then there was also a Model 90 that was designed to replace the Stearman biplane. But that also went through some iterations and didn't work out. And also, this particular airplane was built for the Navy to see if it would work for a float plane and a shipboard airplane. Didn't work out. Only one of those built. But this is a good shot. Here's the Stearman Aircraft Factory now in 1940. And you can see they've added this building here. And they were hiring a lot of people to build the PT-13, the PT-17, the N2S, as many as they could. And they hired a lot of people. And I won't go into it, but Julius Earl Schaefer wrote that I will not hire anybody. I want basically Kansans first and foremost. And he was very tough about who he hired to build these airplanes. There was a lot of women that helped to build these airplanes. And we're going to see more tomorrow about how the women were figured prominently in World War II in Wichita. But eventually they were producing about 4 of these airplanes every hour, almost, ready to come out the door. The demand from the Navy and the Air Corps was so great that they were running 2 and 3 shifts. After Pearl Harbor, it just went nuts. That's all I can say. They could not build these airplanes fast enough. And one of the generals who was in charge of air flight training said, we got to get the men to the front. We have to get them to the front. I can't send them to the front if they don't know how to fly. So getting these airplanes built was a serious part of winning the war. And Wichita was right at the forefront of that. Another general who was in charge of the flight training said during the war, the Stearmans, I'm not quoting him, but he said the Stearmans hold up so well, and I don't care what base we put them at, they hold up. The Fairchilds do not. That he made a distinction between the two. Fairchild was a good airplane. Now here, I guess, is one of the training bases here, and there's a Stearman. Oop, I didn't mean to do that. Back up. Yeah, wrong button. A Stearman here, and these are Naval Aircraft Factory biplanes. They were built in a Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia, their own type of trainer, but they didn't produce near as many as the Stearmans. You can see how many Stearmans there are out here. That's probably Pensacola. Couldn't verify it. And then, of course, toward the end of the war, we see the B-29, save that for tomorrow, but the Boeing, unofficially called the Cadet, but the Model 75, it says that Boeing built 10,346 of those, which is not true. They really only built 8,400, but they had spare parts to build enough to get 10,346. They kind of take that with a grain of salt. It's good PR, but not quite right. And what is the B-29 covered with there? Yeah, $5 bills, $10 bills, $1 bills to help buy the airplane. And I'll talk to you a lot more about that tomorrow. But this is a 1,000th B-29 coming out, and they built 1,644. So it's going to be an interesting story. I hope you come tomorrow. It's one of my favorite stories. And then also China bought some airplanes, war surplus, after the war, and they used an inline engine. They only built a few of these for them. Weren't very successful. And then here's, basically the afterlife of the Stearmans. They were turned into ag airplanes, excellent ag airplanes. There were no specific type of ag airplanes available. So companies bought them cheap, war surplus. You could buy a new Stearman and with almost no time on it for $500, and just fly it away. And they would convert them over into Dusters. And they worked really well. I'll just show you a few pictures. You can see some of the modifications here as well. Jacked up the tail, went to wings, metal wings on some of them, big, up to 600 horsepower engines, re-engineered the whole airframe to do that. And here, going back, this is the Model 4 that I told you about, that there's only one or two of these flying that have been restored, and they're priceless airplanes. Beautiful machines, and you rarely see them at any type of an air show. They're usually kept very in the hangar, but they do fly them. And then here we see a business speedster that's still flying down here, and then a 4CMB up there, mail plane, like American Airlines had. So there's a few Stearmans flying, but the majority of Stearmans you see are hundreds and hundreds of PT-13s and PT-17s. You see very few of the real, what I call the real Lloyd Stearman airplanes. This is a view of Addison Pemberton's airplane that he restored. And on his business card, he says, "We fly the old stuff." And I thought, yeah, that's right. I like that old stuff too. So, again, there's some Stearmans at one of the fly-ins, and they're going to keep them going. And there's always going to be plenty of Stearmans around, I think, for that. So thank you for attending that. And this airplane here, the weird paint scheme, anybody know why it's painted that way? Okay. This was called a recall airplane. When the weather was bad, they dispatched this ship out to the practice area, so all the student pilots and all the instructors, they saw that airplane, you couldn't miss it. It was time to come back to base. Quit training, so it's called a recall airplane. That's a wild paint scheme, for sure. All right, let's see, go ahead. It's always nice to have an expert handy. Okay, yeah, thanks, you're in good shape. So the last story that we have here is right close to home. Travel Air and the 1929 National Women's Air Derby, commonly called the what? The Powder Puff Derby. Will Rogers coined that phrase. All right, so this is an interesting story that's pretty well known here in town, I hope. But it starts at the Travel Air Factory in 1929. And this shows the factory in the summer of 29. And you have all four of the main buildings and then the final assembly building. And then the office building where Mr. Beech, Olive Ann Meller, and other people ran the company. And the water tank here is not quite done yet. And then the white circle out there means this is an aerodrome, if you want to land. And this is the favorite thing about this whole picture, is the hamburger stand. Everybody over there went to the hamburger stand. But you know what? He didn't have a flushing toilet, and we know that because there's the outhouse. So he had a ways to go, you know. But anyway, the factory, this is the way it looked when it was all done. So I'm not stealing any thunder from Travel Air next year. I'm just going to say this. This is the first building that was built after they came out of downtown Wichita, and the offices were here. Then they added this building, then this one, and this one, and this one. So these three were all added in 1929. And how many of you heard of the mystery ship? Okay, the Travel Air. Proper title, Type R, but nevertheless, Mrs. Beech was talking about this, and this is the factory. This is the building where they built the mystery ship. And Walter had, you can't see it here, but you see these big windows. He had all the windows in this section frosted, so nobody could see in. So the Eagle and Beacon reporters came out trying to find out what was going on, and he even got on step ladders, from what I read, to try and see in there, and they couldn't see anything. So they said, Beech is building a mystery ship, and that's where that term came from. But anyway, that's for next year. Okay. So Mr. Beech here, when he was a younger man in charge of Travel Air from 1927 until it closed in 1931. And I won't give you a lot of information on him, but he was a Tennessee farm boy. And he went to Minneapolis in 1911. He was a chauffeur. He drove Cadillacs and, I can't think of the other name. But anyway, Packards and a lot. And he just took care of these cars for bankers. And he was a real good mechanic and learned a lot. But then when World War I started, he enlisted as a non-commissioned officer. He was trained and sent to Waco, Texas, to Richfield. And Richfield is where he learned how to disassemble, assemble, and maintain OX-5, Hispano-Suiza, and Liberty engines. That's where he got his real good background in aviation, right there. And I want to say this. He was not, I repeat, not a pilot in World War I. You'll see the people said, a flight instructor in World War I. No, he wasn't. He was a mechanic. But he became so good, he got promoted. And in my book on the Stagger Wing, it mentioned a letter from Major Whiteside who said, this guy is indispensable. He was going to leave the military. He tried to, no, don't go. I'll teach you to fly. So eventually, after the armistice in 1920, Walter Beech learned how to fly. So you hear more about that next year. Okay, so here's the Travel Air Model A. I'm just kind of going back a little bit with Lloyd Stearman, just to refresh your memory. Out on the California section, first flew in March of 25. And then, this is Ted Wells. How many of you know or knew Ted Wells, or at least know who he is? Okay. He was Theodore Ted Wells. He was a chief engineer at Beech. He was also an intern in 1929 at Travel Air. And so he was a summer intern. This airplane, I should back up. His family was very wealthy. And because of that, he could afford to buy airplanes. And he was only in his early 20s. And this airplane is a Travel Air 4000. And what makes it different is he had some modifications done, but Walter Beech put these wings on his airplane without telling him, and to experiment with what they called speed wings. And these wings were different airfoil. They added about 20 miles per hour to the airplane's top speed, and then it had a J5 radial here. But you notice Ted Wells was a very good aerodynamicist, and he has fairings around the wires here. He has fairings around the bungee cords. You see that? And he was always trying to cut down the drag. He even put some sheet metal here on the exhaust stacks to try and smooth out the flow. Anything to get. So he won quite a few races with this airplane. It was capable of 150 miles per hour. That's fast for a biplane. Very fast. But, of course, he's a prominent with the stagger wing, but that's another story. By 1929, 50% of Travel Air's production, I just want to mention, was enclosed cabin monoplanes. That's what everybody wanted. Businessmen were tired of flying in open cockpits. So enough of that about that. There's a lot more to say about it. And then here's Mr. Beech and Charles Lindbergh. You recognize him right away. And then here's Mr. Beech in December of 1928 with Wallace Beery. Now, I will tell you this one story that was related to me by Madge Doyle. Madge Doyle is no longer with us, but when I was researching with Travel Air, I talked to some of the girls who worked with Olivan in the office at Travel Air. And Wallace Beery, the name, you recognize the name? Yeah. What was it? What was his career? He was an actor. Yeah, he was an actor, a very wealthy actor. He had at least one Travel Air before this one, but he bought the most expensive Travel Air. This is $18,000 for this cabin monoplane, an enormous amount of money in 1928. And he came to Wichita to pick it up with his pilot. He had the flu. He was sick, but he came anyway. And here's what the story is. I'll put this down. It's very interesting. Madge Doyle said, I asked her about this. She says, oh, yes, I remember that very clearly. And he came into the office, and Mr. Beech introduced him to everybody, and then he left. And Wallace Beery, with that same overcoat on, walked up to Olivan Miller at the desk, and he said, I guess I owe you some money. And she says, yes, sir, you do. You owe me $10,000. He said, okay. He reaches into the overcoat, pulls out cash in rubber bands, hands it to Olivan, and says, I want a receipt. So he got a receipt, for sure. And then Madge said, after he left, Olivan said, come on over here. I'll let each of you hold it for 5 seconds. And she did. Everybody hold that money for 5 seconds, those four girls, and took it back and made sure it got to the bank. So I thought that was an interesting story to relate on that. And here's Olivan. And you know, Olivan had a very strong affinity for polka dot dresses. But she never learned to fly, and she had no interest in learning to fly. But you know what her strength was? She was just simply, you want somebody to run an office and keep the books, you got the right person. There's nobody better. And Walter knew that early on when he took a fancy to her. And you know, it's not a Travel Air story, but according to Clyde Cessna, his son, Eldon, who's passed away, Clyde hired her right out of Staley Electric in 1925. They needed an office secretary. This was way downtown behind the Broadview. That's where their first little factory was. They had to have somebody because they were building airplanes. They didn't have time for that. So they hired her, and he noticed right away. He said, my dad noticed that Walter was always looking at Olivan, always looking at her. And so he said, my dad went up to Walter one day, and he said, why don't you just marry the girl? And so he did in 1930. But anyway. Okay, so this is about air racing. And this is a Cessna monoplane going around a pylon at almost 90 degrees bank, low to the ground. Air racing was really popular in 1929. From my research that I've done, it was just below Major League Baseball in attendance. That's how much people loved air racing. Now you can realize that a lot of this got started in 1927 when Charles Lindbergh flew, and that just ignited everybody in this country for aviation. Okay, so here's Mr. Beech, again with that pipe. Always had those pipes in his mouth, frequently with a Travel Air. And he is in charge of the company now, and that's going to become important for our story. Herb Rawdon and Walter Burnham, on their own, not being paid for it, off time, designed the Type R. So here's the mystery ship, the Type R, that they built with the frosted glass behind all that. And this airplane won the 1929 Thompson Cup at the National Air Races in Cleveland. And the reason I mention that is the Women's Air Derby were also part of the National Air Races. So Travel Air just like cleaned up at the 1929 Travel Air. I got to tell you one story about Walter Beech here. When one of his mechanics that I talked to researching for the book, I asked him about what it was like when that airplane arrived. And he said the first thing they did is they pushed it into a hangar and closed the doors. They got to keep it. Walter knew how to build up the PR. And this airplane was built because Walter said he was tired of the military airplanes always winning the races. So Rawdon and Burnham said, we can take care of that if you let us. And he said, all right, do it quietly, go, do it. So this is what they ended up with. Beautiful airplane, too. But one of the mechanics that went to Cleveland to maintain the airplanes told me that Mr. Beech, with his pipe in his mouth, he went around to the different Army and Navy guys taking bets. And taking bets that he was going to beat these guys. And they just laughed, because they had the expensive pursuit ships and a big horsepower and all that kind of stuff and the government money. So he took the money. And, of course, this airplane won by a large margin. And he said Mr. Beech went around with a smile on his face and just collected that. Do you know how much he got? He told me $60K from all the people. And I don't know if that number is right, but it sounds good. But he said he used to give money to the guys, $100 bills, to some of the mechanics here. Go out and eat, go out and eat. So it may have been right. Walter was a generous guy. Okay, here's the Women's National Air Derby. Women pilots now were becoming, there was lots of women who were learning to fly. And you can imagine who the most prominent and famous pilot was in 1929 with the initials AE. Okay, a Kansan. So she did a lot for aviation. There's a whole different story there. So this was going to go from Santa Monica to Cleveland, 25 entrants. Only 20 ended up actually entering. And there's some names there that you see, including Amelia Earhart. Now, that was sponsored by the National Exchange Club, which, by the way, still exists. And all the airplanes had this logo on the fuselage. And they said, we usually do a lot of things for men in the civic communities. No, we're going to do this for the women. We need to get women into aviation. So they were very pro-women aviation. So they sponsored this. So then, at that point, it had to get some airplanes to get to Santa Monica to fly the race. So what they ended up doing is going to a route. And this is the route they had, 17 stops. And it's pretty self-explanatory. Santa Monica, right on up to Cleveland. So it was going to be about 8 or 9, 10 days if the weather wasn't bad. And there was a lot of controversy about this in the press. Well, women shouldn't be doing this. They can't handle airplanes over distances like that. You can imagine the mental problems that they had, mostly from the male press, for that matter. But they forged ahead, as they should. Now, this airplane is a type D4000. That's Louise Thaden, which most of you have probably heard of her. She's flying the airplane, so this was taken during test flights, not during the actual race. I'll talk more about the airplane later. But all the airplanes, in order to meet the cubic inch displacement limits for the heavy class airplanes where the Travelers fit in, and Amelia Earhart's airplane and all that, they had below a certain cubic inch. So they were powered by J5s. There were more powerful engines, but they busted the cubic inch limit that they set for the race. So you're going to find the same airplane on a lot of engine on a lot of the airplanes. But it was fine. There was nothing wrong with that. And the first person to enter was Marvel Crossan, a lady you may not have heard of, but she was a pilot, and she and her brother Joe did a lot of flying in Alaska, up there, bush flying. She was a good pilot. And she was the first one to enter, so she got the paint number 1 on her airplane. You can see the logo back there for the National Exchange Club. And the airplane, I'm going to talk about it a little bit. This airplane was very unique because Walter had to come up with 5 airplanes for these ladies to fly. So there was different ways of doing that. And this is one of them. Now I'm using this photo because if you look at the cockpit, it's only about that wide. This is a narrow fuselage airplane. I only know that I've been able to find out they built 3 of these, 1925, 26, 27, 28, 29, and this is one of the later ones. Very tight, short wingspan, and it was a lightweight airplane. So this was the one that she was able to buy, and then Travel Air modified it to suit her. And we'll see about that. Now this is at Santa Monica at the starting line, and there is Marvel's airplane. You can see the wings are short wings, short fuselage, very narrow, and a J67, 240 horsepower right radial. And you want to mention one thing. If you notice on this airplane, this is the exhaust is collected in this ring, and then it comes out right here. That turned out to be a very bad situation, and I'll talk about that a little later. But other airplanes here, this is Louise's airplane right there. And again, her airplane was a Wright J67 for Marble Crossing, 240 horsepower. And this is her taking off and heading for the first stop. She was expected to win the race. Amelia Earhart had a Lockheed Vega. They were the Learjet of the day, and that's why she had that airplane. And she was probably going to win, but this airplane was fast also, about the same as the Vega. And here's another sister ship called a B-11D, very same type of airplane that was built, but earlier, not for 1929. They were very compact and sharp, good air racing airplanes. And this is another view, just showing the overall configuration. And this was the first one. This was called the Chaparral. It was not an official Travel Air name, but it was built. It's the same type. So there's 3 different airplanes that I was able to find photographs of. And the pilot there is Art Goebel, who won the Trans-Pacific race to Hawaii in 1927. And so don't know where the picture was taken, but it was a beautiful airplane. All right, another entrant after her was Florence Lowe Pancho Barnes. There's people chuckling. Yeah, Pancho was a real character. Had a heart of gold, but as they say, could, outswear anybody, just about. But a good pilot, a very good pilot. I do know from people who knew Olivan did not like Pancho Barnes at all. But when she came to the factory, she basically treated her nice and all that. But Pancho was just overwhelming compared to Olivan, personality-wise. It just couldn't be more different. But nevertheless, she was a customer. So the airplane she's shown with here was the second Travel Air Type R that went to Cleveland. It had an inline engine. The inline engine was awful. They brought it back to the factory, put this J67 on it. She bought it in 1930 and flew it for a long time. So enough said about that. She's an entrant. Here's another view of the airplane here out in California. And Louise von Thaden is probably one of Wichita's favorite girls. And she was learned to fly thanks to Walter Beech to a great extent, and was very successful. She's the only woman in 1929 anyway that held the altitude and endurance and speed records all at once. And, the women pilots back then were breaking those every week, it seemed, always trying to outdo each other. So here's Louise in her airplane with the Exchange Club logo and the number 4 on there. And another one, Blanche Noyes, a good friend. And this is a Travel Air factory in the background. They built her this airplane, brand new type of airplane, Model 4000 with the J5. And she had only been a pilot for about a month. But she was allowed to enter this thing. Another story about her. And then also Mary von Mock, who I bet nobody in here has ever heard of her, but she was a wealthy lady, and that's her Travel Air that she ordered for the race. And then this is just a general picture of air racing to show you how popular it was. I don't know where it was taken, couldn't find out. But air racing drew crowds like crazy, like I said. It was just below Major League Baseball in the summer of '29. And here's a group, not the total group, of the entrants for the Women's Air Derby. I'll just point out a couple of people that are very obvious. Over here, where'd she go? There she is. Louise right here. Mary von Mock, Chubby Miller, and Bobby Trout is well known. Ruth Elder, Thea Rosch from Germany here, and I know her name, can't think of it at the moment. But anyway, so there were 2 different classes. There was a heavyweight class for like the Travel Airs and Vegas, and there was a lightweight class for the lower horsepower. So it's 2 distinct classes. And this is Louise before the race, just talking with some people. Don't know what she was saying, but it's a good view of the cowling and the front-mounted magnetos on the J5. And it's a picture of her in the airplane. She was a really good pilot and so well liked by all of her lady friends, and also just really a nice person. Okay, yeah, Phoebe Omley. She was the lady, I couldn't remember her name. That's her airplane right here. Little Moncoupe in the lightweight class. And this is lined up to get started. So let's see what happens. Okay, so the way this worked, they would wave off each airplane, and there was a timer who would start the time, and they would get time. The person who won the race, it wasn't about speed. It was how well you could navigate. If you could navigate, you kept your time en route low. So it was really a thing about speed. It was a thing about navigation. And this is a good view of Santa Monica here. And just real quick to point out a couple of airplanes. Louise's airplane here, and Blanche Noyes back here, and then Mary von Mock, Amelia Earhart right there, and then Thea Roche in a de Havilland, and the rest of them are kind of out of sight there. But they were waved off one at a time. And this is during the race at one of the scheduled stops. This is Louise watching the starter. So when she was going to take off that next morning. And there's the route. Now I want to point this particular place right here, Douglas, Arizona. This is where Marvel Crossan was killed. And the reasoning on that is that they wore parachutes. They had to do that. But they think that she was asphyxiated by carbon monoxide poisoning because of the location of that exhaust stack. That's the theory. No one's ever proven that. But nevertheless, she was overcome, and she tried to bail out, but couldn't open her chute. So she just hit the ground and was killed. And this is what's left of her airplane. And it took them several days to find it. So, of course, the press went crazy. And what do you think they said? See, women can't fly. Stop the race. Can't do it. And the women said, we're forging on. It's exactly what Marvel would want us to do, and they were right. So Louise was able to get to Cleveland with the best time for the heavyweight class, and Phoebe Omley got there for the best time with the lightweight class. She needs to get recognized. It's important. So Louise is there, and getting swarmed around. She's waving to everybody. Got a couple other photos here that are interesting. This is Walter Beech. And you know what's interesting about it is Walter, that's fine, but look at all the grease and the grime and oil and everything else that they accumulated. Every time they stopped, they would clean the airplane up and go to the next stop and clean it up. But nevertheless, she's getting out of her shoulder harness there. And Walter's saying, good job. You won the race in that area. So there's a picture of him and her. Walter was not known for smiling a whole lot, as you know, but he did occasionally. And this is what Louise Saden said in her book. They put this big wreath around her, but never took the stickers out of it. And it hurt. So quickly she had them take it off and said, go hang it on the airplane engine. So they hung it on the engine instead. So there's a picture of her. And these are three of the ladies here, Louise and Ruth Elder and Gladys O'Donnell. They all finished the race. Amelia, I think, was third. I think she was third. She had some trouble. But it was a good race for the ladies, and this is the cup that she won. And how many of you been to the Beechcraft Heritage Museum, Tullahoma? That's where this is. You can go see that with some other trophies that she won as well. And this is Opal Coons, who also flew a Travel Air, placed within the top 10. And this is Phoebe Omley, I told you about, who was able to win the lightweight class. And she's often forgotten, so I want to make sure I put her in there. And then just kind of the overall results. And then in the 1980s, the airplane that Louise flew, some parts of it were found, and it was restored as close as they could get. Now, it's not that many original parts, but it was flown around, and the airplane eventually is right here in the Kansas Air Museum. Has anybody seen it? Aviation Museum, thank you. And so that's where it is. and that's a great place for it. I don't know how long it's going to be there. But, yeah, maybe so. And there's a little better view of it. Famous airplane. Okay, now that concludes the 3 stories for today. And I don't know what time it is. Eric, how did I do? Oh, good. Okay, I was trying. This is a nice picture of Louise, too, with the Travel Air and all that. So that's it. Tomorrow we'll do 3 more. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'll try to tangle with this microphone better than yesterday. First off, I want to thank Eric and Zach and everybody else who's made this possible. And today we're going to look at 3 different stories. And we're going to start off with Mr. Cessna and his son Eldon, and then we're going to transition to a Christian and Missionary Alliance. And you might say, what has that got to do with airplanes in Wichita? Bear with me, you will see. And then finally, the one that probably everybody knows about is Wichita building the B-29. And it's a very familiar story, but I think it's one that can always be told again and again because it's so significant. So let's start with Mr. Cessna. One second. And again, we'll hold off on comments and questions till we dismiss. And I think that worked okay yesterday. So again, it's a brief history of the CR series monoplanes as originally conceived, designed, and built by the CV Cessna Aircraft Company, not Cessna Aircraft Company. And I'll explain that as we go along. This is the Cessna plant as it looked in 1929 on what we would call the California section over there. But Mr. Cessna was able to get the factory built that he needed when he was down here on the west side of town, on the west side of the Arkansas River, but it's not pronounced right. Mrs. Beech stopped me dead in the middle of an interview and said, Mr. Phillips, it's Arkansas. And I said, yes, ma'am. So it's been Arkansas River. I thought somebody would shake their head. But anyway, he had orders for hundreds of airplanes and couldn't possibly produce them in the little 2nd Street factory. So Curtis Wright helped him get this built. And then he started building the airplanes, and the crash came in 29. So Mr. Cessna was always, and he said so, more interested in building airplanes than flying them. As a matter of fact, tell you a little more about that. So that was the factory, which is still there, but covered up with lots of other buildings. In 1929, these were his bread and butter airplanes. At the bottom was a Model AW, which was, a lot of those were built. And then at the top is the DC-6 series, and they were powered by 2 different engines. They were both cabin monoplanes. And by now, the cabin monoplane was very popular with business pilots and companies. And in 1928, this gentleman here is Earl Rowland. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he used to be in Wichita. And he flew this Model AW in the Class A division of the New York to Los Angeles Air Derby and got Cessna a lot of notoriety with that airplane. And you'll see more about this airplane because it has multiple lives. All right. Then later on in 1930 is when Cessna got into air racing more, the company. Now the factory was still open at that time, but it was bad. But the GC-1 and the GC-2, GC-1 on the left, GC-2 on the right, were built strictly for racing because excuse me, the demand for private airplanes was slowing down, but air racing still promised some type of income or revenue. So these 2 airplanes were both built for different races, and neither one of those still exists. But the point is that Mr. Cessna was always interested in air racing. And this is Mr. Cessna at the top and his son Eldon at the bottom. And I was just curious, did anyone in here ever meet Eldon Cessna? Okay. I had a couple of times. He's an interesting gentleman to talk to. He was Clyde's son and very much interested in aeronautics as well. Attended college, did not finish. He was not a graduate engineer. But again, kind of like Matty Laird yesterday, he just had a natural intuition for engineering and mechanical things. Mr. Cessna, as you know, had very little education, and he too was just basically self-taught. and fixed farm machinery when he was young, and then it progressed on to cars, and always interested in mechanical things. So the reason I point these two out, because this company, the CV Cessna Aircraft Company, they're the two people and a few family members that owned the company. And we'll see what happened here. Now, this airplane is the same AW you saw with Mr. Rowland, but about 2 years later. And Eldon took this airplane and modified it for air racing. And you can see some changes that he made. Let me point them out real quick. Very small landing gear wheels and fairings, and a cowling around 145 horsepower Warner, static air-cooled radio, all kinds of streamlining on the cockpit area. And this was a pretty fast airplane. And Eldon flew it in local races, regional races, national races, and he really collected quite a bit of money. And he was a good pilot as well. Okay, this little building here, many people never heard of, but this is the Mooney factory. And the Mooney factory was located down on South Oliver, and had been around for quite a while. A number of different companies were in that building, but Clyde and Eldon took the building over after Al Mooney left. He only built one airplane, and then he left. And this is where these CR-Series Racers were built. And one of them, and part of a second one. I want to show you that. Building no longer exists. And I have to insert this about this particular gentleman. I know you've never heard of him. That's okay. But I was aware that he was involved with the design of these racers, and here's why. In the mid-1980s, Bob Pickett, anybody know Bob Pickett, besides these gentlemen in the front row here? I asked him if he could work out an interview with Dwayne Wallace, and that was very tough to do. But Mr. Wallace finally agreed to do that, and I went down to the fourth, and I had 4 interviews with him before he died, and it really provided a lot of good information on these things. So I'm always very appreciative of that. Mr. Wallace told me about this man. And, of course, a young Dwayne Wallace, very interested in aviation, he would go down to that building, and he would watch his uncle and his nephew, building these racing airplanes. And Garland Peede was there. Now, he used to work for Eagle Rock Aircraft Company up in Denver, Mile High, and was a good engineer, good designer. And he designed the Eagle Rock Bullet, which was a cabin monoplane. It had retractable landing gear. That was pretty good for 1930. And he had a lot of input into this first racer you're going to see, the CR1. And it looks like nothing you've probably ever seen before. It certainly doesn't look like a normal Cessna, but it was a very, very tiny airplane. So I wanted to make sure that he got some credit for that. He later left after a disagreement with Clyde Cessna. And that left just Clyde and Eldon to work on the next few airplanes. Okay, here's the CR1. Now, before I show you the photo, there are no photos of this airplane, but I have a photo of this airplane. And that sounds strange, but WSU has nothing. There's nothing online except, you won't believe where I found it. I canvassed all over the internet for these things, and one aviation enthusiast in Russia had a photo of the airplane. I said, you got to be kidding me. And he said, you want to use them? I said, yeah, just give me credit. I said, okay, no problem. Here we go. That's what he designed. It was a radical airplane, very radical. And this is not Clyde and Eldon Cessna's idea of what a pylon racer should look like, but that's what Garland Peede said. You want it fast? This is fast. This will do 220 miles an hour. But the thing about it is, if you look at the empennage, the whole fuselage is 12 feet long. The wing is 16 feet. And, shoulder-mounted wing, enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, cowled engine, 145 horsepower Warner. So this is where Mr. Wallace, where it got very, very interesting. The first flight, Garland Peede was supposed to make the first flight. He's gone. Who's left? Clyde's not going to get in this thing. That's all there is to it. Nope. But Eldon says, I'll fly it. Now, Mr. Wallace said that Mr. Cessna was not going to let his son, his only son, fly this airplane. And I want to tell you something. I'm not exaggerating. This thing was a beast. It was a nasty airplane. It was short coupled, which means any kind of elevator input would send this thing going crazy. It was laterally unstable. It was longitudinally unstable. But it was perfect for going around pylons. It's exactly why Pete designed it the way he did. So finally, Mr. Wallace said Clyde had reluctantly agreed to let Eldon fly it. Okay, let me look at some other pictures here. This is a side view. You can see the retractable gear. And you can look at the size of the guy with the propeller. You can see how small this airplane is. It's very small. And the gear was cranked up. You took off and cranked it up with a chain, hopefully. And when it came up, I'll show you a better picture, but right here are great big doors that came up and boom, closed behind the gear, so it was all sealed up on that. And the windows, you may ask for, what's the window in there for? The windows, when the gear's down, to make sure it's down. That was important, make sure it was down. So we'll see about that. Okay, here's another view. You can see that Mooney building in the background. Really small, beautiful wing, but 145 horsepower Warner. So it came time to fly the airplane. Now let me give you the short story on that. Mr. Wallace was witness. So I wrote down everything he told me, and I believe he probably got it right. He said that when Eldon taxied out and added full power, this thing shot across the grass like a bullet. And Eldon was able to get the tail up enough, and it just wouldn't go off the ground. He couldn't get it to lift. Why? Short wing. You need a lot of speed. He ran for about, I think it was 700 or 800 feet, and he ran into a berm, and it bumped the airplane up into the air. Now it was flying. But that's when the instability took over. Mr. Cessna about had a heart attack, Dwayne said, and everybody was a small group of people, a very close group, and the airplane's just going like this. Eldon's trying to keep from crashing it. It was awful. And he thought, how's he ever going to get this thing back on the ground without killing himself? Well, he managed to do that, and he flew around very wide. He couldn't bank the airplane too much. He came in at about 120 miles an hour to the grass and just cut the engine and just let the thing go boom. And it just bounced and bounced and bounced and came to a stop. And everybody went, whew. So Eldon never got in this airplane again. Neither did anybody else. That was the end of the CR-1. Seriously, I'm not exaggerating. It was just too nasty an airplane to fly. Look at the size of the horizontal stabilizer in the elevator. I mean, it's like, ah. And later on, Eldon said every time I'd put a control stick into it was way too much. The airplane would just overreact. Then I'd have to pull back, and that was too much. Then it went this way. He could never find an area where he could get level flight. So that's not a good airplane. Okay, that's the story of the CR-1. Short-lived. It went back in the building, and Pede was gone, and they said, well, okay, we're going to modify it the way we want it. So here's what happened. This became the CR-2. Same basic airframe, but going to look very different. Ah, there's the airplane 3 months later. And it has the same engine, but you notice the retractable gear actually looks pretty simple now. And no doors. You let the tire close it up when it goes up. And the wings went all the way to a whopping, 18 feet. And the fuselage was extended to about 14 feet. So it should fly a lot better. And here's another view of the airplane running up. And this is over at the municipal airport in 1932. And it had been towed. That's a Model A Ford convertible back there that they towed the airplane with. It belonged to Mr. Cessna. And it's getting ready to fly it. Now, to fly this airplane, they brought in the man on the left, Roy Liggett. And Roy Liggett was a farmer, but he was also an experienced air racer and a friend of the Cessnas. So he's the one who's going to fly the airplane. That's Eldon here. And again, the Mooney factory and Mr. Liggett and the CR-2. And Mr. Wallace was present at this, and he described to me that Mr. Cessna, this is Clyde Cessna, right here, helping Roy Liggett, and there's Eldon, and helping him get his parachute on and get ready to test fly this airplane. You notice it's open cockpit as well, and it doesn't look near as menacing as the CR-1, that's for sure. And here he is getting in and getting ready to taxi out. That's Mr. Cessna there with the suit on. And so Mr. Wallace said this flight was very uneventful. Airplane took off nice, no crazy maneuvering, came back around, landed. Well, how fast did she go? How fast was she? He says, well, I think, Lloyd Liggett said, well, I think I was going pretty fast. Well, how fast is that? Well, maybe 180 miles an hour. Well, he was just a good old country boy. But anyway, he could fly an airplane. So the airplane began to be modified and enter into races. And by 1933, it looked like this. It had a different cowling on it, and the airplane had some improvements in aerodynamics. You can see some fabric around here to try and cut down on drag on the tail. And if you're wondering what all this is on the cowling, it's because the cowling would pull forward and get rubbed by the prop. And they had to learn how to deal with that. And Travel Air had the same problem with the Type R mystery ship. It would pull forward in high-speed flight, and they had to figure out how to keep it back so it wouldn't do that. They eventually figured it. Now you can see interesting flying suit that Mr. Liggett has on there. Some coveralls. Okay. So what happened after the Mooney building was destroyed in a tornado, they had no place to build airplanes. So they went to Curtiss Wright and asked if they could use this factory right here. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. Hold on a minute. There's small buttons on here, and I sometimes get them backwards. Okay. Now I got my thumb on the right one. This building right here. And they transferred their equipment in there, and they built the CR-2A, which we're going to see now. And this was just an improved airplane, trying to get more speed out of it. They needed to make tight pylon turns. They needed the airplane to be consistently in the 230 mile per hour range if they were going to make any money with it. And Liggett knew how to fly it, but they had to constantly improve the aerodynamics. So here's some of the modifications. You can see the cowling now, and it's got blisters to cover the valve covers on the radial engine. But not much else had been done except the cockpit has folding doors. You can get in a little easier, get out a little easier. And the airplane, by this time, was becoming quite competitive, as a matter of fact. And they named the airplane Miss Wanda after Clyde's daughter, Wanda, and it was painted red. And this airplane, it never really won a race, but it would come in second. It was not quite fast enough. They continued to make modifications about it. Still had a 145 horsepower engine, but it was not as competitive as they wanted, but they were making money with it. There's no question about that. And here's another view of it from behind. And you can see the cockpit is very different than on the other photographs. Here, where it closed up. And there's little plates over top of the landing gear to help seal up that area. And again, minor changes to the empennage. But you notice how the ailerons just basically span almost the entire trailing edge of the wing for just good roll control. Because the idea, this airplane is going to be pulling, going around a pylon, it's going to be pulling somewhere close to 4 and 5 Gs. And that's really pretty tough. So that was a stout airframe, very stout. Good machine. So they made money with it. And unfortunately, in 1933, in August, Liggett was flying this airplane and at the Chicago Air Races, and he made a speed pass. And there's different stories. The best one I can come up with that I think is probably right, part of that cowling broke loose and tore the left wing off, just broke it off. And the airplane just went a rapid boom right in the ground, destroyed, killed Liggett instantly. So that was the end of the CR-2A. Mr. Wallace, however, told me that it so devastated Clyde Cessna that his friend had been killed in an airplane he had built that he took care of Liggett's family for the rest of their lives, financially. Not surprising. That's the way CV was. Now, this gentleman here is Johnny, and Johnny is Livingston in 1930. This was the guy they were always chasing with their airplanes, one of them. That little monocoupe right there had clipped wings, the same engine as the CR-2 and CR-2A, but it was always 3 or 4 miles per hour faster. Just that little bit. They couldn't get out of those other airplanes. Well, he decided after he was beaten by in second or third place by Cessna, he said, I got to get one of those. So he took the airplane, flew it down to the Travel Air Factory, and said, let's take the engine off of it. I'll sell the rest of the airplane. I want you to build me a Cessna Racer. And this is what he got. All right. And it's the same engine that he had in his monocoupe. You notice the gear is still the same. Crank it up, crank it down. Had a little cockpit canopy and some of Livingston's influences on it. And here it is to give you a little bit of size scale. That's Livingston there with the parachute on. And Tex Legrone, he was a well-known pilot. He's on the right, and I never could identify the gentleman on the left. But anyway, this airplane had a career for exactly 60 days. It won every race it entered in those 60 days, every one of them. He beat everybody with it. And he made a lot of money. But you know how things come to an end. And this is the final configuration. He modified the cockpit, the gear, and just a few other tweaks with the aerodynamics. And I forgot to mention, before this airplane was built, Dwayne Wallace was still going, being an aeronautical engineer, was going to college here. And Livingston consulted him, and Mr. Wallace said, I urged him to use a shoulder-mounted wing, not a mid-mounted wing, to get a little more, maybe 2 or 3 tenths of a second around the pylon. I mean, that's how precise these guys were. And it did. He was right. And Livingston took his advice and it turned out to be good advice. And here's another view of the airplane shortly before it crashed. And again, you can see the pilot there and the other airplanes. It was very small. So totally, it was 18 feet, 11 inches long, 17 feet, and had a ready-to-go weight, empty weight of 750 pounds. That's all. That's it. And 145 horsepower. So he did set a record with this airplane for the 500 cubic inch displacement engine class, 237 miles per hour over a 2-mile course. So that's about how fast it could go. And you're not going to get any more out of it than that. So here's what happened. That's what's left of the CR3. It never lost a race, but on August 1st, 1933, Livingston he had to bail out because the gear would not crank down. And I don't know this, but Clyde probably told him, don't ever try to crash land this thing, just get out of it, because you're going to kill yourself if you try. And that's what he did. So he managed to get out of the cockpit safely, and the airplane just buried itself in the ground. And according to estimates, it hit the ground at 300 miles per hour. Well, maybe, I don't know. But it looks like it did. But in any case, so that was the end of the CR-Series Racers. So there wasn't very many of them, but Mr. Cessna did make some money with it. And that famous quote up there, I saw many times in my research when he would talk to the press. They'd ask him, why are you flying monoplanes, one wing? Well, he said, speed is the only reason for flying. You know what? That's still true today, is it not? So, yeah, in 1912. So that is the end of that, and then we'll transition to this next one. Let's see how this goes. Yeah. All right. I know this is kind of an oddball. Yes, sir. That's another story. But that's a good question. It's very strange what those guys can do. Anyway, this is talking about the Christian and Missionary Alliance. I don't know if you've ever heard about that. Part of this is it's a missionary organization, and they had people in Borneo. You know where Borneo is, I'll show you. And this has to do with Reverend George Elba Fisk and the fact that he wanted to go to Borneo before World War II, and he wanted to minister to the Dayak Indians. So there is an airplane in this. Just give me some time, okay? It will be there. But I think the background is important, or the story doesn't make sense. So here we go. Here was Borneo, right there. And this Australia, you can see all this area where World War II was fought, Guadalcanal, and all that. So that's Borneo. And he was up here in this area here, in northern Borneo, ministering to these Dayak Indians. Now, the Dayaks were, some of them were basically normal people. They lived along the river's edge or in small towns. The other tribes inland were cannibalistic, okay? They were not nice people. And from what I read, the way they increased their territory was to kill others and eat them. So I thought, well, I guess that'll probably do the trick. Anyway, so here's what we're looking at overall. Borneo in that area, and down in this area here, Jakarta, the East Timor Sea, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. So that gives you an idea where he was. Now this is just a view. It's a very beautiful country. I doubt anybody here, I've never been there, I don't imagine you have either, but it's a very rugged area. And this is a little close-up of that northeastern area around Tarakan. And Tarakan had an airport there, a very crude airport, not like we would think of one. But this is where he was going to be flying out of. And this is a picture of Reverend Fisk and his wife, taken in 1922, after they were married, and they had applied to go to Borneo and serve as missionaries to these Dayaks. And that was quite a bit. And you say, well, how did he get interested in the Dayaks? According to his story, at 12 years old, he went to a county fair, and there was the wild man from Borneo, one of those sideshows, and he got interested in them. And he decided he wanted to reach out to them with the gospel. So that's how he got started, believe it or not. So they were missionaries. So they sent them, his wife Anna, in 1929, and they went to northern Borneo. And it mentions there 8 years old. I'm sorry, I said 12. 8 years old. And that's when he saw the wild man from Borneo and decided he wanted to help those. And they were headhunters, too. You'll see some of that just coming up. Okay, so now this is Fisk on the right and his wife behind him and some other missionaries that were going into that area also. Just thought I'd show you. So here are the Dayaks. And these are pretty tough guys. And you can tell who the chief is because he's got the biggest headdress. Kind of like Western Indians, right? They never knew each other. But they have got spears. I read up on this. These guys could throw these spears very accurately. They were well balanced. They also had blowguns. They were very good with that, poisonous darts. And you can see that they had their own defensive shields here and all that. Really, really interesting characters. But for the most part, not interested in eating anybody, but at least not where Fisk was going to be. Okay. This is another view of the chief in the middle, a different group of guys there. And another group. Now, there's the shrunken heads, if you can see them back here, some of their victims. Okay? So there was a lot of truth to that. They were headhunters and they were cannibals. And this is the people that he wanted to minister to. Now, that's a gospel challenge. I want to say, if there ever was one. And this shows some of the men who were not hired, but became militia trained by the Dutch, because the Dutch were in charge of that area, the Dutch East Indies. That was their territory, and they trained these guys and gave them some rifles and some swords and things like that, and machetes, so they could defend themselves under the islands if they needed to. So there was 14,000 Dayaks when Fisk arrived in this area where he was going to be responsible for. And this shows Reverend Fisk with some of the Indians that he had was able to reach out to. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but he went for years and years and years before they would even trust him. You can imagine that. A white man comes in. I don't even know if they saw a white man before. And we're talking about up in the boonies. I'll show you some photographs that would scare any float plane pilot. Is there a float plane pilot in here? Okay. But Reverend Fisk, his biggest challenge was, how do I get to these people? They're up in the mountains. They're miles and miles away, and the only mode of transportation was the river. That's it. So it was a problem. And here's some of the he and his wife on some of the Dayaks that they had trained to start their own churches. Now this is years later. And you can see that Mr. Fisk, Reverend Fisk, is getting a little heavier there. So it's been a while. But they did respond to the gospel. And then here's their little Joy that they had, a little child that they did have over there. And that was in 1930. So they've been there now well over almost 12 years to get this far. And this is Joy. She just grew up with these. These were her friends. And then, this is the territory that he was dealing with. You see the river down here, very circuitous. All these mountains. Now, there was villages up in these mountains, and he had to reach them. And the only way he could do it was with a very special canoe. I want to show you this. I was not aware of these things until I did this research, and I thought, wow, that is something. There is what they call a Praus, a prouse. It's like 60 feet long, very narrow, and these guys are skilled handlers, and they would run those rapids and run the rivers with these things. That's how Reverend Fisk had to get around. He was gone sometimes for 2 months from his family to go in upriver and go up into the mountains to help with medicine as well as preaching. It's both, not just one. So the prows were really efficient. Now here's a view of, you can see this is a modern one. They still use them. And some of them have outboard motors, some of them don't. But it was a very efficient craft. Okay, so that was the way he was getting around. Now here's some view of the river that comes, you notice that the vegetation comes right down to the side. There's really no bank at all. And the Dyaks knew exactly where to take him, but they always were very careful that we don't want to go over here. These people don't like us. They'll kill us. So we need to go over on this side of the river or on this tributary. And he just did whatever they said because they knew what they were talking about. But things changed. And when he came back on leave from Borneo, he realized by this time, I need an airplane. And not just an airplane, I need a float plane where I can go up and down these rivers. So in the late 1930s, he came back on sabbatical and he learned to fly in this Bird, B-I-R-D, is the name of an airplane company, the Bird. And he petitioned the CMA, Christian Missionary Alliance, please buy me a float plane so I can do my job much, much better. And they decided, no, we can't afford that, because it was still the Depression. Understandable. Well, he continued to negotiate and talk to different people. And finally, in 1939, he was able to go to Beech Aircraft, and two of the people in the CMA went ahead and took money out of their own savings and paid for a float plane so he could take it. And he said, you got to go find which one you want. Well, he did a lot of research. I read his letters. And he sent letters to all kinds of people, visited factories, and he decided Beechcraft was going to be the best. See, I told you there was an airplane in this. Anyway, so there's the factory after Walter and Olivan had moved back in there in 1934. So they've been there for quite a while. So he wanted a Beechcraft, and he told them what he wanted, and this is what they built for him. All right, it's an SE-17B airplane, and then it was taken up to Long Island, and the floats were put on. So this is this particular photograph here. Yeah, the gentleman that bought the airplane actually is Mr. Jaffrey. He's not shown there. But the gentleman on the right is a CMA senior advisor, and he made sure everything was done properly for the CMA. And the gentleman next to him is a Beech test pilot. Okay, so the airplane was test flown. It was all certified, and then they took it apart and shipped it by sea all the way over to Borneo. Now, when it got to Borneo, it was given a Dutch registration, PK-SAM, put back together, and then the Dutch naval authorities examined the airplane and decided it was airworthy, and then they gave it a certificate for the East Indies. So he finally got that far. It was time now to fly it. But you know what? Even though he had an American pilot's license, the Dutch made him go get a Dutch pilot's license. So they were able to do that right there. Okay. So here's the airplane at his home base in Tanjung Salur, up there in northeast Borneo. And you can see that they just built a very crude ramp so that they could pull it up and down. He trained Dyaks to pull the airplane up and pull it down, how to get it in and out of the water. And he said, though, that it took about, once the airplane showed up, it took them about 3 months before they'd go anywhere near it because they were scared of it. They never really seen an airplane before. And they called it the Big Yellow Bird. And it doesn't look yellow there. That's just a film. But they said, my crop failed because of the big bird. And my person got sick because of the big bird. They were, very, very superstitious about things like that. All right. So here's a picture of Reverend Fisk and Anna with the airplane, and he immediately put it into service. And that's where the interesting story is to me, so let's get to that. He learned how to fly it on floats, but once he got there, he was on his own. Navigation, what navigation? He didn't even have a chart, hardly, for anything up there. But he knew, with the Dyacs, he finally found 2 of them who would fly in the airplane. One thing's to look at it and touch it, but fly in it? Well, they did. He needed them to go with him to help. So they did. So they began to fly, and they helped him a lot. And here's his runway. And he said he often would learn the currents and the winds and the weather, and he would just get that airplane out there and just hit that engine, and he would just go around the curves, keep going, and just kind of finally she'd break loose off the water, and away you go. So it was an interesting thrill. And you can see these mountains aren't exactly inviting, if you have an engine problem. So here's one of the makeshift docks they built. The Dyacs helped him build little places where you could just taxi up, shut the engine off, tie it down, unload supplies. He also airlifted patients out of there. Eventually, they began to trust him, and then he would fly them to Tanjongsolor and give them medical aid. And in some cases, he would fly them all the way to Java, 600 miles over water with this airplane. But it was built with every fuel tank that Beech could put into it. So it had a range of about 600 miles. And this is a little bit of what his base looked like. The river's way down at the end of the photograph there. And here's PK-SAM taxiing up. And here's the makeshift hangar that they're going to build out of bamboo. So they built a hangar for it because he wanted to keep it out of the weather. He did all the maintenance on it. He just learned what he could from Beech and went from there. Fabric work, all of it. And here's typical transportation item right here. This is commercial revenue. But he's shown standing up there, and then, of course, they would transport these animals to places where they needed them for some reason. I don't know what they were, usually dead, of course. And bear in mind that he's helping people, and he's spreading the gospel, and he's helping people with medicines, and he's doing lots of things. And here's another view of the airplane at another little sandbar. And here they are manhandling the airplane down into the river. And if you notice, there's people there's a prow there and a prow over here. In case anything went wrong, they would jump out and help control the airplane, because these are swift currents. And you got to remember, this is about a 4,000-pound airplane. And if it gets moving, it's hard to stop it. Okay, and this is, again, a little dock here where they're loading a person into the back seat of the airplane. And, he kept some fuel and oil at these places and whatever he needed when he made these trips. So he went from leaving on a trip in a canoe and coming back 2 months later to he could make 12 trips a month back and forth with this airplane. It was extremely well suited. And here's another one of those little floating docks that they did. And unloading another person or whatever it happened to be, and getting it into the hangar, all by manpower. And here is Reverend Fisk. Once a year, he had to fly the airplane all the way back to Java for the Dutch to inspect it. And they would put their stamp of approval for another year. And that's why the airplane's shown. Now, this Java area back here behind it, you notice the oil tanks? Well, by the time this picture was taken, the Japanese were not long from taking this over, all right? Because you know that they needed oil. That was something they did not have in Japan. So the Indies and Indonesia and all that area where the oil was, they attacked very quickly. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so in December 1942, Reverend Fisk and Anna came back. And they departed the Netherlands East Indies. And notice here that said during their 12-year ministry, they had led more than 5,000 Dyacs to place their faith in Jesus Christ. Many of these converts became teachers and evangelists to their own people groups. And that's true. And you know what? I checked. They're still there. There are still churches all over that place because of what that man did. All right? And he established at least 24 new churches with Dyak ministers. And he firmly believed that the Christian Dyaks would remain loyal to the Dutch if war came. And that is true, they did. Now, the Japanese had made it clear that they did not like white Christians living in the Orient. And if he and Anna returned to the Netherlands East Indies, they told him this, that they would be immediately forced into a prison camp and executed. So that gives you the idea. This is just before the war. Hadn't even started yet. All right, so in 1946, I'll tell you what happened on that a little bit later, but he returned without Anna, and he died in 1977. Now here's where the story gets interesting. They're gone, and the replacement pilot that came to take over from Reverend Fisk was also a missionary and an experienced pilot, and his name here was Frederick Jackson. And so he took over PK-SAM and all the different missions. Now, the Japanese invaded, as you know, December 7th, 41 was Pearl Harbor. The next day, they hit Borneo, Java, they hit Singapore. I mean, they were all over. And they easily took over the Borneo. And the first thing they did was collect the missionaries, the white people. And this is Frederick Jackson. He made very few trips with the airplane. The Japanese knew it was there. They told the Dutch authorities, put the airplane at this place in the river near Tarakan, and we are going to basically assimilate it into our air fleet. Don't touch it anymore. And the Dutch said, sure, that's okay. Well, they had a plan, you know. So Reverend Jackson there, he did some flying. Now, here's what happened. I have to, in between here. These are photos from a movie about Borneo. This is not official photos, but what it's showing is accurate. The airplane was basically floating on the river one night, and the Dutch authorities rowed out there and set it on fire so the Japanese couldn't have it. And it burned, and it sank into the river, and it's still there. What's left of it. And then they rounded up all the missionaries, and they put them in prison camps. Men, women, and children. Doesn't make any difference. Squalid conditions from what I read about. Awful conditions. You know, I mean, worse than you would think. This is in early 42. So, you notice there's a couple of, back here, there's 2 Catholic nuns and a Japanese guard. And these two, so I mean, it was accurate in the movie, and that's why I went ahead and used these, so you can show something about it. And the Japanese, again, they had already warned what they were going to do, so they kept the women separate from the men and the children. And they were, let me just say this, because you have to be very discreet here. Their treatment was horrendous, if you can read between the lines, the Japanese did to these women. It was awful. So they didn't keep them there very long. And 2 of the missionaries that were rounded up were the Sandys. And Reverend Andrew Sandy and his wife Helen. And they no sooner got there than the Japanese invaded, and they were thrown into this camp. Okay, and they had a 3-year-old son as well. And they executed their son, and they killed both of them. No sooner had they gotten in a prison camp and just killed them. That was it. Now, this next photo is from the movie, but again, it's accurate. And here's all the missionaries after they were killed, and the Japanese went around and bayoneted them multiple times just because they were white. They were Christian people. And it's a very accurate portrayal of what happened. And finally, after the end of the war, the CMA wrote to the Japanese and said, what did you do with the people, our people? And they said, well, we killed them. And we know nothing about them beyond that. You know, that's what the Japanese said. They just simply said, we don't know. But in 1946, Reverend Fisk in the center there, the CMA got another float plane stagger wing, the D-17S, this case a war surplus airplane, and sent it back to Borneo because it was so useful. He did not go back and fly it, however. But now it's PK-SGM instead of SAM. different airplane, different registration. And this airplane flew for a long time in Borneo, doing the same thing Reverend Fisk had pioneered. There's another view of it. And then finally, you know, airplanes like this Beaver, de Havilland Beaver, came along that were far superior, and the stagger wing disappeared. Don't know what happened to it. Somewhere in Borneo. Not exactly sure. So again, 40 years of dedicated service for him. And it was he thought, very well worth it, and it was, because he was able to accomplish his mission. The end. So that's where the Beechcraft came in. Okay, so next one up is the B-29, and this one everybody in here can probably identify with, because you know about World War II and Wichita and the B-29. I may have a couple of things you didn't know that I found out, but in general, you're familiar with the story, but if not, you'll learn. So this is the 1943-1944. Wichita became the epicenter of Boeing's struggle, and that's the right word, maybe it's even too mild, to give General Henry H. Arnold. Who was he? He was Chief of the Air Corps. Okay? He was a 3-star. And in those bombers that he needed to inflict horrific destruction upon the homeland of Japan. So, you know, people say, well, why didn't they use the B-17? The B-17 was a very famous bomber. Some of you know what that looks like. Boeing airplane. It didn't have the range. It didn't have the fuel capacity, the bomb load that they needed to bomb Japan. Now, a little bit of background, because I think it'll help. Franklin Delano Roosevelt got Hap Arnold into the White House, in the Oval Office, right after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and said to him, from what he wrote, FDR said, I want Japan bombed now, as fast as you can. Well, who actually did that in April of 42? Doolittle, yeah. So it was bombed, but that's not what FDR had in mind. He wanted to use a heavy bomber to do that. He knew the B-17 wasn't going to do it. Okay, so the Army had put out a request for proposals in 1939 for a super heavy, and that's the right term, super heavy bomber that would be able to fly to Japan, drop bombs, and get back, although they kept it undercover. Well, in 1939, nobody was at war except Europe. And when the Japanese and America were at peace, but this was the airplane that they proposed, and this is the one that the Army Air Corps chose. The best design. There were 2 or 3, but we'll talk about this one. And this is a picture of Wichita. And you say, what's that doing in there? Well, it's taken by our famous Edgar B. Smith. How many people heard of Edgar B. Smith? Yeah. 1926, folks. That's what downtown Wichita looked like. In case you're curious, you see anything you recognize? I see one thing I recognize. Right here. We're in that building. You seen that one, Eric? I figured you had. Okay. And this, of course, is the Arkansas River. Got that down. All right, and the Broadview Hotel and all that. So just wanted to put that in there because I thought it was a nice photograph. And this is Edgar B. Smith and his standard J1 that he used to take photos with. And by the way, Walter Beech and lots of different pilots flew this airplane for his photo missions. Okay, now, as far as Stearman is concerned, I mentioned yesterday that in 1930, the United Aircraft and Transport Corporation built this brand new factory on South Oliver to build biplanes. Now, as the 30s progressed and Stearman hung on by that American Airlines contract that kept them alive, then Boeing was designing the B-17 and all that, and they gave them subcontract work. They built the throttle console and other things for that airplane. That kept them going. But now, when Pearl Harbor hit, remember they were building, at that point, this was their only product, the PT-13, the PT-17. And I said yesterday they roll out 4 a day. It was 4 a week, my mistake on that, that's memory. But 4 every week they were putting these out. And now the Army and the Navy gave them orders for thousands of trainers. And they're sitting there thinking, you've got to be kidding me. And Pearl Harbor just changed everything overnight. So Julius Schaefer, who is in charge here, gets things going. And they start putting more buildings together there, and they hire hundreds and hundreds of people, teach them how to build these things, to where they were cranking them out really fast by 1943, 44. Now here's a view of the Stearman factory here, looking eastward toward the Missile Airport. Not a great shot, but it was the best one I could find. And by 1943, this is about, roughly 1 week's of production. They were putting airplanes out right and left. And Schaefer just praised these people as they came in from the farms, they came in from the colleges, they came in from the streets, learned how to build these airplanes, and they did a very, very good job. Critical, men and women, both. Didn't make any difference. So you can see one building that got added on here is the final assembly building. Now remember this photograph, because in a little bit I'm going to show you none of this is there. These airplanes are long gone. And this whole area is paved, and you're going to find B-29 sitting all over this, waiting to get to the front, so to speak. Okay. This is a little-known story, but it's important. And I just happened to discover it. The gentleman on the left is Hap Arnold, General Arnold, Chief of the Air Corps, or the United States Army Air Forces. And we know we had different air forces. There was the 8th Air Force, the 15th Air Force, and all that all over the world. And he was in charge of all of them. The gentleman on the right, on the other hand, is William S. Knudsen. And Bill Knudsen was an interesting guy. He was a president of General Motors before the war. But he had built his reputation on knowing how to manufacture things fast. So he was called into the White House and with General Arnold, and they gave him 3 stars on the spot and said, "You are the chief of manufacturing, win the war." That's basically what FDR told him. Go win the war, you know. So what happened is in late August 1940, we're not at war yet, these 2 men came to this town secretly and went down to the Stearman factory quietly, and they went down south about a half a mile or so and surveyed that whole area. And they said, this is where the B-29 is going to get built. Now, why would they pick Wichita? Well, it's in the middle of the country. That's good. They know they got a workforce. They kind of already proved that, and they can get a whole lot more. So I don't know that anybody realizes they came here quietly, undercover, picked the place to build the B-29, and went back to Washington. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit. I never knew about that. Now here's the hero, Julius Earl Schaefer. And it says here, on May 17th of 41, still no war, Schaefer, general manager of Boeing, Wichita division now, was stunned by orders from the War Department to immediately, quote, purchase with utmost haste jigs, dies, fixtures, and all critical materials essential to production of the B-29 at Wichita. Sure. including construction of a massive factory complex, which had just been picked out, measuring initially 1,130 feet long, 1,200 feet wide, and employ 20,000 people. Okay, it gets worse. Yeah, okay. Now these are Schaefer's words, and I thought they were great. Boeing's Wichita division was woefully unprepared to tackle anything the size of the Superfortress. Now here's his quote. Schaefer summed it up like this. Wichita has been called upon to obtain tooling that does not exist, install them in a non-existent factory, manufacture the world's most sophisticated bomber whose design, development, systems, and blueprints are in a constant state of flux or change, and build it with a non-existent workforce, having no experience for such a task. Oh, by the way, General Arnold wants it 2 years ahead of schedule. Now, that's what this city was up against. And I have my own little way of saying this. In order to make this work, I say it this way. Boeing declared war on the B-29. Think about that. They declared war on their own airplane because that's about all they could do. Normally, this airplane was supposed to be in service in 1946 or 47. Pearl Harbor changed all that. They needed it now. So this is what they were up against. I don't know how Schaefer did it, but he pulled things together. He got all the support he needed about that. But the government would own the factory, but Boeing Wichita had to build those airplanes. Okay, so you get a little bit of an idea here. In June of top left box. In June of 41, ground was broken south of Plant 1, the Stearman, where they were building the trainers, and the Austin Company began a Herculean task of building this 2.8 million square feet of floor space. It was done in January of 43. Okay, the new factory was to be built on more than 180 acres. Well, it had its own rail line, so there'd be no interruption in getting materials in there. 130,000 pieces of tooling, jigs, and fixtures were installed as rapidly as the Austin Company released space for occupation. That's true. I read that as soon as the concrete had dried enough to support the tools. They were waiting in the hallways, right in there, and bolted them down, started making parts. This is what we're looking at here. It's amazing. So again, the B-29 was going to be a 5 or 6 year program. Pearl Harbor torpedoed that, no pun intended. But Boeing was forced to expedite design, development, testing, and manufacture of the bomber in 36 months using unskilled workforce. And the first airplanes that were built there were 14 YB prototypes, YB B-29s, and Boeing was under tremendous pressure from the War Department to rush it into full-scale production. They had no intention of using this in Europe. They didn't need it in Europe. The B-17 and B-24 were doing fine. But for those vast distances of the Pacific, they needed a super heavy bomber that had 3,500 mile range, could carry basically 20,000 pounds of bombs, and do it at 300 miles an hour. Okay, try to keep moving along here. I like this photograph. It's interesting. Here's Hap Arnold and Julius Schaefer, and this is in January of 1944. And what he is here for, he came in to see how things are going. He wasn't real pleased because can you just imagine what they were trying to do to ramp up and build this airplane? I think you can understand. It's just almost an impossible task, but they were going to do it. And he said, he actually quoted here, he said, "I want to see the 175th bomber." Well, there it is, serial number 61665. Oh, by the way, ladies, this is very important. Ladies, 40% to 44% of these bombers were built by women. And I like to point that out. Very important. All right, so what Hap Arnold said, he scribbled something on the fuselage, and here's what he said. Quote, "This is the airplane I want, and I want it by March 1st. By the way, he got it on February 28th. Okay? And Arnold wrote a message, and it says, quote, "The end of a job splendidly done. Thanks from the Army Air Force." All right? So that was the airplane. He had no idea of the trouble that was coming. He thought things were going to go along pretty smooth. He had promised FDR in the Oval Office, "I will bomb Japan in 1944. Didn't make it. And he got hauled on the carpet for that. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, here we go with the plant. This is, of course, a later photograph during the war. You can see how big it is. Poor little old Stearman plant's down here a little bit. But, you know, here's all that complex. Here's these B-29s rolling out. And they were on 3 shifts, 6 days a week. They did not work on Sunday. Everybody seen this before? Oh, yeah. Rosie the Riveter. The background on that is, quote, I'm going to read it because I can always remember it. In 1942, Westinghouse Electric Corporation's chief artist, J. Howard Miller, created the iconic poster, Rosie the Riveter. It became the trademark of women's contributions to winning World War II. So he's the guy that's responsible for that as well. So in concert with that, you can see, here's 2 ladies right here. One's young, the other one, probably a grandmom. You know, everybody came in here. We're talking 24,000 people in Plant 2 during the war building the B-29, and 40 or 44% were women. So they got trained, and you know they came from all over the country. It's just a massive story. I can't begin to tell it right, but that's what they're up against. Now this lady is Connie Palacios, who is not here today, but that's Doc in the background, your airplane here in Wichita. And she came in at 18 years old and at Boeing Wichita Division in 1944, and she built B-29s, including Doc. Okay? So if she was here, we were going to give her a round of applause.
And she's not here because she's preparing, as we speak, to leave for Europe to go to the 80th anniversary.
Yeah, D-Day. That's right. Good for her.
She'll be 100 years old in January.
That's it. So if you ever have a chance to meet her, tell her she did a good job. And this is an example here of women doing wiring for the flight engineer console on the B-29. I don't remember all the number. I think it was something like 3,000 miles of wiring. And I forget, I don't remember all those numbers. But here it is when it's all finished. And here's the cockpit. And you remember part of the B-29 was pressurized so they could fly without wearing oxygen masks. And you say, well, why is that important? These were 15-hour missions out to Japan and back. You can't suck on an oxygen mask for that long. You just can't do it. You'd have to have huge tanks for oxygen. So it was pressurized partially. Yeah, it was very hard. The bombardier's in the front, and the pilot and co-pilot and the flight engineer, he's just kind of out of sight there just a little bit. Here we go with some various photos. I'm showing some of these from Wichita, most of them, some of them from Bell, and some of them from Martin, just to kind of show how 3 companies were building these airplanes fast as they possibly could. And you know what? One of the things that happened, all 3 of them suffered this. They would get the airplane ready, and let's say they had the cannon plugs for wiring, where all the wires came in, then he would hook it up to something. Well, all of them found out that cannon plugs were inferior. They didn't work. Okay, take it all apart. This costs time. This is what drove Hap Arnold mad. I checked it. He had 3 myocardial infarctions during the building of the B-29, 3 massive heart attacks, but he survived them, all because of this pressure from the Oval Office on that. So, again, he was interesting. This is a Wichita photo here. The airplanes were rolling out. And when you see these kind of photos, you kind of wonder, why did the Japanese think they could beat us? You know, are you kidding? There was nobody going to bomb the United States. But nevertheless, now you saw this photo yesterday, just a little different view, showing a 1000th B-29. And they were building them. How many? 1,644 is the generally accepted number from Wichita. Built more than Bell, built more than Martin. And Boeing was too busy building other airplanes, including the B-17. All right. Now, here's, again, the ramp at Wichita with, and I told you there was going to be some airplanes parked way down there where those trainers were. They were making, these airplanes were rolled out. They found out that they had all kinds of problems. I checked. They had 54 issues on these airplanes that had to be completely reworked. Why? Because they were rushed into production. And they'd start building the airplane, and somebody would come out, from what I was told from a guy that worked there, said, we'd be building something in the back shop and get it all done. The guy would come in and say, 2 changes. Because the Army Air Corps constantly wanted things changed. So it slowed the process down. It was unfortunate. Okay, so now, here's some of those areas that were a problem. One off were the guns. These were remote, automatically controlled by an analog computer. There wasn't anybody inside these turrets. That was a problem. A big problem were all these plate glass windows. They leaked, so the pressurization wouldn't hold. They had to take them out, put them in, take them out, put them in. The people that manufactured the plate glass got a visit from the government and said, you will fix this now. And that happened to all the vendors. Anybody who had a problem, they had to fix it, and they wanted things done. In the next 24 hours, you better be shipping the right stuff to Wichita, Bell, and Martin to build these airplanes. Another area, the biggest area here, oh dear, did it again. One more. I think. No, I'm going. I'm trying to go backwards. Oh dear, I was doing so well. There we go. The biggest problem right here were these engines. The Wright R3350 was 2,200 horsepower. They didn't expect it to be put into an airplane that fast. They didn't have it all developed. Didn't matter. That's the only engine that would work. So they had lots of trouble. And I'll give you some statistics about how many B-29s went down just due to mechanical problems, not the Japanese. And there's other ones here too, electrical, landing gear, brakes, flight controls. There was trouble all over these airplanes. So when Hap Arnold checked and said, okay, we're going to start bombing Japan in April of 44. This is January of 44, and there's hundreds of airplanes sitting there not combat ready. He about had his 4th heart attack. And so he put his a couple of generals in charge, ordered them to get these airplanes to China and get them fixed now and get them to China. Well, he did that. They were managed to work things out, and they began to send them over there. In early 1944, they would start flying to China. China was the closest we could get to Japan. And even with the B-29, they could only bomb the southern half of Japan. They wanted to get to the whole country, but they couldn't. So the airplanes a lot of them went down en route because of engine troubles. And when they got to China, they started doing some bombing runs under a different general than the one I'm going to talk about here, out of China. And they were flying. They thought, we'll do this just like we do in Europe. We'll fly at 31,000 feet, okay, and we'll carry lots of bombs, and we got the Norden bomb sight, and we'll just drop the bombs, and that'll take care of Japan. Well, it turned out that they were very, very wrong. They didn't understand or definitely did not estimate properly the winds at altitude. And a lot of times they would fly from China, and the winds would be a headwind. So now those engines are sucking fuel, too much fuel to get there and back. So they had a problem with that. And then when they did get to it, the first one they targeted was the Yawata Steelworks in Yawata, Japan, down south. And I think it was something on the order of 60-some bombers dropped their bombs. And this is documented. One hit. All the rest of them missed by a wide margin. Why? The winds. The winds just blew the bombs away. So that brings up an interesting person. This is Bombs Away LeMay. That was his nickname. Curtis LeMay. All right, tough guy, 2-star. They fired the general who was running the B-29, 20th Air Force in China, brought him in from Europe and said, fix the situation. Hap Arnold was adamant that they start doing something. So what he did was not popular. What LeMay ended up doing, I'll show you here with this map. Okay, when the Marines, bless their heart, any ex-Marines here? Okay, anyway, the Marines in the Army, when they were able to take Saipan, right here, Tinian and Guam, all right, now 1,500 miles from anywhere in Japan. The airplane could make that. Before they were coming from China over here, and all they could do was get a part of it. Now you can see, here's the span. They can get almost all of Japan from these islands. So they were rapidly built up by the Seabees as well. And this is Tinian. This is what Tinian looked like by 1945. They had 2 bases. They had a base down here. Well, geez Louise, did it again. I'm sorry. It's just tiny little buttons. Okay. They have an airfield over here for B-29s, and they have another one over in here for fighters. But here's the main B-29 base. 4 runways, all of them at sea level, 5,000, 6,000 feet. And these airplanes were going to be taking off as many as 300 on a mission to bomb Japan. And the airplanes weighed 67 tons. They had 7,000 gallons of avgas, 20,000 pounds of bombs, and LeMay had them take all of the defensive guns off these airplanes, except for the tail gunner. It's the only one he left. And he said, gentlemen, we're going to go to Tokyo, and we're going to bomb at night, and we're going to bomb at 5,000 feet, not 31,000 feet. We're going to hit these people. And so that's what they did. And his crews were just, you can imagine if you're a pilot flying at 31,000 feet, this is easy. Japanese fighters can't get up here. The flak can't get us. And we're going down to what? 1 mile above the ground? They're going to be all over us. But he said, no, if we bomb at night, I don't think they'll get us that bad. Well, he turned out to be right. So here's the B-29s taxiing out. And they took off, and again and again and again from those 2 bases. Not every day, because they had the weather too. But when they hit, they were going to hit hard. So many of these airplanes, I don't want to forget, many of these airplanes are Wichita-built airplanes that went to Saipan, Tinian, Guam. There's some Martins and some Bells in there, but a lot of them were Wichita-built airplanes because they were the first ones to get over there. They were combat ready. Now this is a staged photograph, but I like it because it shows different ground crew. Now here, this is before LeMay came. See, they're putting great big belts of 50 caliber ammo into the turrets. And you got these are 2,000-pound bombs. They're not light. And so it just gives you an idea of the ground crews. Everybody had to make this work. Everybody. And now here they are flying over Japan, early missions, and they're not very high. You can tell that. And can't see what they're bombing, but they're dropping high explosive, 2,000-pound bombs on Japan. And their targets were simple. Target the war production areas. Now the Japanese were smart. They said, we know the Americans, if they come and bomb us, are going to go for our factories, so we'll surround all these factories with homes, wood and paper homes. They won't hurt our people. Wrong. LeMay was willing to kill. He said that. I'll be a war criminal if we lose the war, and I'll be executed. But we're going to kill the Japanese, and we're going to kill their industry. That took a ruthless mind, but he had that. That's why he got picked for the job. All right, so They found out very soon, LeMay did, that the high explosive bombs were just not doing the trick. They weren't enough. And then he switched over to these. These are incendiaries. These bombs were filled with a jelly gasoline, and they will be dropped all over Japan to start fires intentionally. And the fires would burn as hot as 1,800 degrees. And they bombed, I don't have a total number, but many B-29s. A B-29 here could carry up to 150 of these canisters. And if you multiply that times 300 airplanes on one mission, and they're all dropping one after the other on a city, you can imagine. I'll show you some of the things that happen. This is why LeMay still is branded almost like a war criminal and a murderer because of what he did to the Japanese. But on the other hand, he said, well, it's war. Okay, so here's some B-29s dropping the incendiaries, and a couple of them, that's why they're just going all over the place, because they didn't weigh very much. And they had them in those canisters, and as soon as they came out of the canisters, they would separate, and some of them would just drop. It looked like confetti there on the right airplane. Others would get down close to the ground, and then they would pop out and go and land on the houses and immediately start fires. Now this is Kobe, Japan, and here's incendiaries being dropped down on the naval depot at Kobe. You can see that they're not very high, and they're in the daytime on top of that. But believe it or not, the Japanese fighters were confused and didn't realize what they were doing, what fighters they could dispatch, and the flak gunners were quite inaccurate. Did they knock down airplanes? Yes. Let me give you the numbers if I remember. There's 414 B-29s lost in Japan in the war, and not over Japan, but in the war. And about 87 were shot down by fighters outright, just shot down. Others were hit by flak, and the rest of them were mechanical failures. So here's the next thing. Now here's Tokyo. And the worst bombing that got started was March 5th of 45 on what they called Operation Meeting House. This is all in May. And they sent hundreds of bombers over there at night. And you can see all this is fire that you see there from the incendiaries. They killed about 110,000 people in one night. And they devastated some of the industries as well. A total of 67 cities were firebombed in Japan to rubble and ashes, 67 of them. And these fire bombings, I triple-checked it, amounted to 338,000 deaths from one end of Japan to the other while that was going on, only with incendiaries. They quit carrying the high explosive bombs. These are what did the destruction. And so it was just a terrible thing, but they had to be done. This is another view of Tokyo on another night. You can just get an idea of what it must have been like on the ground. These make their own weather systems. They suck the oxygen out of your lungs, and didn't matter. Men, women, and children, nobody could escape. But I want to forget one thing America did do. They sent Pathfinder bombers over there during the day, and they dropped many, many, many tons of leaflets. And they said, I read one, "We are coming tonight to bomb your city. Please leave. You have been warned." So we did warn them. But guess what? The Japanese didn't want anybody to leave because they're the people that were building their war machine during the day. So they did at least try to do that. However, I did check on the 2A bombs. We did not send a warning. Anybody want to guess why? The military wanted to see just how bad it would be. So they didn't tell anybody they were coming for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They wanted to see what these bombs could really do. Well, they found out. Ruthless, but nevertheless, it was war. Okay, and here's another picture of another city. Toyama. Toyama is about in the middle of Japan. That was the worst city. 95% was burned to the ground. 95%. There was almost nothing left. Another view of Tokyo on another night. They just kicked back. They eventually burned, I believe, 1/4 of Tokyo was just totally destroyed. And it was big even then. But they did not touch the imperial palace where the emperor was. They were very careful about that. And here's just what it looked like. You can see where all the structures were that were made out of paper and wood. And people would run to the rivers and get in, but it didn't make any difference. They suffocated before they got there, or they drowned. And this is another view. It was just horrific. If you can imagine Wichita looking like that. So the B-29s were the airplane, the instrument that Hap Arnold wanted to use, and General LeMay did this. It's, by the way, one other thing. LeMay never got permission to do these fire bombings. He just did it. He never got it cleared with Arnold, never got it cleared from the White House. He just did it on his own and took a risk. And actually gave him some more stars for that. Oh, boy. Now, this is just an example. I told you a lot of these airplanes never made it back. And Iwo Jima, everybody's heard of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was an emergency strip on the way back from Japan for these bombers that were crippled. And so they would crash land. Including this one person here, this one Japanese pilot. Whether you like Japanese in the war or not, they were human beings too. We don't want to forget that. But this particular man here is a Captain Terahiko Kobayashi. And you'll see on the side of his Ki-61 fighter here that he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 B-29s he shot down, and one that he took his fighter and rammed it. And a lot of Japanese fighter pilots just rammed those things, just ran them. And he was able to bail out and survive. A very interesting situation. Okay. And then this is one of the airplanes he did that with. This is a Kawasaki Ki Hien, or Tony. And in this photo, later on, you can see he's got, oh gosh, I got to quit doing that. It's so easy to do it. Come on. Okay. The pointer is hard to get to. He has about a dozen B-29s, B-24s, B-25s that he shot down. And he survived the war. He also flew this airplane, which is the same airframe, but with a radial engine and not an inline engine, and it got better performance, and he shot B-29s down with these, too. And here's some battle damage from flak, mostly. Just badly damaged, but they were able to get back and land. The B-29, like the B-17, was very tough. And here's one here, just ran into a ditch in Iwo Jima. You can see some of the support ships out there, not long after the invasion. And this is a junkyard of B-29s. This is on Guam, and there's a lot of Wichita-built airplanes piled up there, because they had a majority of the ones that got there first. So they salvaged everything they could, threw the rest into a great big pile. And you know about the Enola Gay and what it did on August 6th of 45. And then on August 9th, Boxcar, both of which survive in the Smithsonian. Now, I usually get a question about this time. Well, what happened to the flight crews that went down in Japan? Well, they were killed, basically. I read several different accounts. Some were put in prisoner of war, but because of these fire bombings, they had no mercy on them. And as far as they were concerned, we had no mercy on them, and they showed our air crews no mercy. I remember that there was one B-29 crew that got shot down by flak. They crash landed. The Japanese army was out there, bayoneted every one of them, just killed them right then. Other times they would take a few of the crew that were alive, take them into town, and just turn them loose and let the people have them. And the people beat them, stabbed them, just did that, beat them to death. And the ones who were in the prison, they just suffered very much the same type of fate. So it was a very bad thing to be shot down and go down over Japan. But there was a lot of crews that did. So here's the facts, summing up. Total, now this is Bell, Martin, and Boeing Wichita, 3,888 Superfortress bombers were produced by 3 companies. We mentioned that. In 43, Plant 2's work week was increased to speed up delivery of the bombers. Instead of 3 7.5-hour shifts, 6 days a week, it went to 2 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Women made up 40% of the workforce. I mentioned that, possibly 44, 2 different sources. In June of 44, the 20th Air Force began bombing Japan from China. We know that didn't work. Lots of those airplanes were Wichita-built bombers, almost exclusively. Employees worked consecutive shifts for up to 3 days, napping on cots. I had a couple of guys before they died tell me that they did that just to keep busy, to keep the airplane going. And not until 1945 did they reduce it to a 55-hour work week, but by then the war was won, basically. This is what's interesting. In 1943, when they began building these airplanes, the first 100 airplanes, each one required 157,000 man-hours to complete because of all those problems. When production ended in 45, it only took 17,000 man-hours to complete each of the final 100 airplanes. So that's how long it took them to work out all the bugs from that. Production at Plant 2 peaked in late 44 at 4.2 bombers per day and 100 per month. Can you imagine that? And I checked. Japan was capable, they didn't have any bombers like this, but they were capable of building about 10 fighters, 15 fighters a week. Fighters, not bombers. Germany, forget it. They were already bombed into oblivion. The Axis couldn't hope to match that. And during the war, Boeing Wichita was the largest employer with a total of 29,795 people on the payroll. And they manufactured enough spare parts and assemblies to build another 125 bombers at the end of the war. And the final B-29 rolled off Wichita, Boeing Wichita, in October 45. So I wanted to add some other companies in here on this final note. According to the Kansas State Historical Society, during World War II, Boeing Wichita, Beech, Cessna, Culver, altogether manufactured 25,800 military aircraft with enough parts and assemblies to build another 5,000. So this city has a tremendous legacy that I hope nobody forgets on that. And last but not least, your own national treasure here is Doc. And everybody seen Doc? Just about? Okay. And Dave, I'm hitting you aside. Do you want to get up and say anything about Doc's friends for a minute?
I can tell you that we had over 400,000 man-hours donated to take Doc from the year 2000 when it arrived here on 7 flatbed trucks from California, where it had been used as a target at China Lake. And it was the only airframe left that was salvageable, basically. And one airplane from World War II, Fifi, B-29, owned by the Commemorative Air Force, was the only flying B-29 at the time. In 2000, we got that airplane back here. And 400,000 man-hours, many of those man-hours by people who had worked on the original airplanes. Connie Palacios is not the only one that actually worked on those airplanes. And the airplane is now, it flew for the first time. It took us 16 years from the time we got it here to get it into the air on July 17th, 2016. And it now flies a regular schedule of what we call ride flights and tours, various air shows. Sure. It's off doing that right now. And I worked with Tony Mazzolini, the guy who actually found Doc out on China Lake. He's a former Confederate Air Force wing commander from Cleveland, wanted to get a B-29 for their show airplane. Mm-hmm. And he found it, and he finally got it to, got control of it, and had it in Inyo Kern, California. It had set in the desert as a target. Fortunately, the Navy bombers weren't real accurate, for 42 years. And so Tony got it here, and 16 years later it's flown. We now have, as you know, the Doc hangar over at the airport. Yeah. And I worked with Tony over the course of the last 2 years, and we'll have a book coming out called Rescuing Doc, hopefully within the next few months. Okay, well, thanks. That gives everybody an update. So, yeah, only 2 of these in the world now, and that's it. So thank you for attending, and I guess we will, if you want to, we'll dismiss, but I'll stick around for questions on any of those 3 topics, and thank you very much for your attention, and thank you, Eric and all, for letting me come.